My son's wife shoved my wife into the hallway wall in front of every guest we had invited into our home. My wife hit the drywall with both hands, her frail shoulders absorbing the heavy impact. The entire dining room went completely silent. My son immediately stepped forward and declared it was an accident. My name is Jameson, I am 69 years old, and I'm about to tell you exactly how I systematically dismantled my own family to protect the legacy of the woman I loved. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who severely underestimated your intelligence and your worth. The violent shove came completely without warning. My son's wife pushed my frail wife directly into the hallway wall in front of every single guest we had invited into our home. My wife hit the drywall with both hands, her weak shoulders absorbing the heavy impact. The entire dining room went completely silent. My son immediately stepped forward and declared it was a simple accident. I did not raise my voice. I walked my wife to a chair, smoothed her dress, and placed one single envelope on the mahogany table in front of my daughter-in-law. The color instantly left her face. My son started screaming. That envelope contained the deed to our summer house, a strategic sacrifice I made to buy peace for my wife's final months. Instead, it only bought vultures. I stood by the open grave watching the polished oak casket rest on the mechanical lowering device. The morning air carried a bitter chill biting through the thick fabric of my black wool coat. Coretta was gone. 42 years of marriage built entirely from the ground up in a tiny apartment before we purchased this sprawling estate in the suburbs ended in a quiet hospital room just 2 days ago. I looked across the freshly dug earth at my son Damon and my daughter Ebony. They stood shoulder to shoulder, dressed in immaculate designer mourning clothes. Damon's white wife Heather stood beside him, clutching a delicate lace handkerchief to her perfectly dry eyes. Seeing Heather dab at her face brought the memory of that deed back to the forefront of my mind. Giving them that property only made them hungry for the rest of the carcass. They tasted wealth, and they wanted it all. The cemetery workers engaged the heavy gears. The casket began its incredibly slow descent into the cold earth. The minister bowed his head to offer the final prayer. The handful of attendees closed their eyes respectfully. Right at that exact moment, my cell phone vibrated violently against my ribs. I kept my phone on silent, but the distinct buzzing demanded my immediate attention. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the device. I shielded the bright screen with my hand to block the harsh glare of the morning sun. It was a text message from Ebony, my own daughter. She stood less than 10 feet away from me, her head bowed in fake reverence while sending a digital execution order. I read the words displayed on the glowing screen. The message stated exactly, "The estate is frozen. You are not getting a cent. Move out by Friday." I read the brutal words a second time to ensure my aging eyes were not deceiving me. They were not. My daughter, the girl I had carried on my shoulders and put through law school, was legally evicting me while her mother was actively being lowered into the ground. She did not even have the courage to look me in the eye. I stared at Ebony. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the dirt. Damon stood beside her, his jaw set tightly. They had clearly orchestrated this cowardly ambush together. They waited until the exact moment Coretta was legally pronounced dead to launch their assault. They assumed my profound grief would paralyze my logic. They assumed I was a weak, grieving old man who would simply fold under the sudden pressure of their legal maneuvering. They believed I would surrender the wealth I spent 4 decades accumulating without a single fight. I did not weep. I did not scream or cause a public scene at my wife's funeral. I calmly placed the phone back into my coat pocket. I turned my back on the grave, on the minister, and on my treacherous children. I walked away from the burial site with purposeful, measured steps. The gravel crunched loudly under my dress shoes. I needed to pay the funeral home director the final balance for the burial services. I had promised Coretta a dignified farewell, and I intended to fulfill that promise before dealing with the absolute betrayal of my offspring. I climbed into my sedan and drove straight from the cemetery to the main branch of my bank downtown. The drive took exactly 20 minutes. My mind raced with complex calculations, piecing together the timeline of their deception. Coretta and I had set up a joint executor agreement for our primary accounts 5 years ago to ensure seamless financial transitions in case of severe medical emergencies. We trusted our children implicitly with our livelihood. That blind trust was a fatal flaw I was now paying for. I gripped the steering wheel, replaying every recent conversation with Damon and Ebony, searching for the warning signs I had missed. They had been overly eager to handle the funeral logistics, insisting they needed access to the main accounts to organize the catering and the venue. I had given them the authorization without a second thought. They used that access to lock me out completely. I pulled into the bank parking lot, the engine humming a steady rhythm. I walked through the heavy sliding glass doors and approached the primary automated teller machine in the spacious lobby. I needed to withdraw the cashier's check funds immediately to settle the outstanding funeral debts. I reached into my wallet, pulled out my primary debit card, and slid it into the machine's card reader. I punched in my personal identification number with practiced ease, waiting for the account dashboard to load. The machine processed the request. The internal gears whirred softly. Then the screen flashed a harsh bright red. A jarring error tone chimed through the quiet banking lobby. I leaned closer to read the bold white letters glaring back at me. The text read, "Account locked by joint executor. Please contact your branch manager for further assistance immediately." A cold realization settled heavily in the pit of my stomach. The threatening text message from Ebony was not an empty intimidation tactic. It was formal notification of a completed financial heist. While I was eulogizing the profound love of my life, my children were digitally draining my primary checking and savings accounts. They had coordinated the attack flawlessly. They exploited the joint executor privileges to freeze my direct access and siphon every available dollar into their own private holding accounts. They left me standing in a bank lobby with a useless piece of plastic and a massive funeral bill. They wanted to render me completely defenseless and dependent upon their mercy. They thought they had severed my financial arteries. They did not realize I spent 20 years building secure secondary systems they knew nothing about. My grief rapidly hardened into cold, calculated anger. The war officially began. I walked away from the pristine lawns of my neighborhood and caught the first bus heading toward the industrial district on the south side of the city. I needed a base of operations completely off the grid, far away from the designer coffee shops and gated communities my children frequented. I carried only the black garbage bag Brent had unceremoniously handed to me. The cold wind bit at my exposed neck, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the sharp, terrifying clarity settling into my mind. Every memory of my children's recent kindness was now tainted by this betrayal. I got off at a corner illuminated by the flickering neon sign of a rundown weekly motel. The tired clerk behind the bulletproof glass did not ask for a credit card or a name when I slid $300 in emergency cash under the transaction slot. He handed me a physical brass key attached to a heavy plastic tag. I walked down the dim, foul-smelling corridor and unlocked a windowless room on the ground floor. The confined space smelled of stale smoke and harsh chemical cleaner. The thin mattress sagged deeply in the middle, and the single overhead bulb cast harsh, unforgiving shadows against the peeling wallpaper. It was a miserable, depressing place, yet it was the perfect tactical command center for my retaliation. I tossed the garbage bag onto the bare mattress. I pulled the small safety deposit key from the lining of my leather jacket and held it up to the harsh light. Coretta had always been a step ahead of everyone. We had survived brutal poverty together before building our wealth, and she never forgot the absolute necessity of having an impenetrable backup plan. I left the motel immediately and flagged down a passing taxi, directing the driver to the main downtown financial sector. This was not the familiar suburban branch where my children had just locked my daily accounts. This was a private, highly secure depository bank catering strictly to clients who required absolute discretion and impenetrable security. I walked through the towering revolving doors and approached the front desk. I presented my secondary identification and the brass key to the silent manager. The attendant guided me past the massive marble columns and into the subterranean vault. The heavy steel door sealed behind me with a resounding click, leaving me in total, absolute silence. I walked down the long aisle of metal boxes and located box number 812. I inserted the key, turned the lock, and pulled the long metal container free from the wall. I carried it to a private viewing booth and set it down on the polished wood table. My hands were perfectly steady as I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, the familiar scent of Coretta's lavender perfume drifted up, hitting me with a sudden wave of fresh, blinding grief. I pushed the emotion down immediately. I forced myself to breathe evenly. Grief was an indulgent luxury I could no longer afford. I pulled out a neatly tied stack of leather-bound journals. These were Coretta's private diaries. Beneath them rested 3 thick black financial ledgers. As a retired systems engineer, I had always maintained meticulous records, but Coretta had taken it upon herself to secretly track the financial movements of our children over the last 5 years. She knew their habits, their weaknesses, and their hidden desperation. I opened the first diary carefully. Coretta's elegant handwriting detailed private conversations I had never been privy to. Damon had visited her secretly while I was away on business trips, begging for short-term cash infusions to cover massive payroll deficits for his technology startup. Ebony had done the exact same thing, crying on our living room sofa about the crushing overhead costs of her luxury boutique. I set the diary aside and opened the heavy financial ledgers. The columns of numbers painted a brutal, undeniable picture of total ruin. I traced the money trails following the routing numbers Coretta had painstakingly documented in the margins. Damon's highly publicized software company was an absolute failure. His cash burn rate was astronomical, and his primary investors had aggressively pulled their funding months ago. He was operating a hollow shell, fending off ruthless creditors and dodging massive corporate lawsuits. Ebony's situation was equally catastrophic. Her high-end storefront was facing multiple eviction notices for unpaid commercial rent, and her suppliers had placed hard legal liens against her entire business inventory. My children were completely bankrupt. They were drowning in a violent sea of their own arrogance and financial incompetence. The brutal eviction at my front door was not an act of simple opportunistic greed. It was an act of sheer terrifying desperation. They needed to liquidate the massive equity of our family estate immediately to avoid facing total financial ruin and potential criminal fraud charges from their angry investors. They did not care if I ended up sleeping on the freezing concrete streets. I was simply a breathing obstacle standing firmly between them and their survival. I flipped to the back of the final ledger, searching for any remaining asset lists or property deeds. As I turned the heavy parchment pages, a loose slip of paper dislodged from the tight binding and fluttered quietly onto the viewing table. It was folded neatly in half. I picked it up, expecting another one of Coretta's thoughtful handwritten notes. Instead, I unfolded a dense, professionally printed legal document. The header displayed the intimidating logo of an offshore private lending firm based in the Cayman Islands. I scanned the dense legal paragraphs, my eyes locking instantly onto the principal loan amount, $2 million. The collateral listed for this massive unauthorized loan was the very estate I had spent my entire life building from the ground up. I looked at the borrower signatures at the bottom of the final page. Heather and Brent, my son's wife and my daughter's husband. The white in-laws who had stood in my driveway looking at me with pure, unadulterated contempt had bypassed their spouses entirely. They had gone completely behind Damon and Ebony's backs to secure a massive shadow loan against my property. Below their printed names was a third signature required by international law to authorize the leveraging of the physical estate. I stared at my own name written in dark blue ink. It was a sloppy, hurried forgery. Heather and Brent had falsified my legal consent to steal $2 million from a ruthless foreign entity, and they were planning to let the estate take the massive fall when the loan inevitably defaulted. I folded the paper carefully and slid it into my breast pocket. The parameters of the war had just completely changed. They thought I was a fragile old man, easily discarded to cover their colossal failures. They were severely mistaken. I was a systems engineer, and I knew exactly how to demolish a crumbling foundation permanently. I sat in the corner booth of a dilapidated diner near the industrial district, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating the forged offshore loan document spread out on the sticky Formica table. The $2 million figure glared up at me, a testament to Heather and Brent's reckless arrogance. They had anchored their massive debts to the property Coretta and I spent decades paying off. I needed a secure environment to examine the paperwork far away from the prying eyes of my children. I assumed my physical distance provided temporary safety. I completely underestimated their desperation. The heavy glass door of the diner slammed open, the metal bell above it ringing violently. Heather marched inside, her sharp heels clicking aggressively against the linoleum floor. Damon followed closely behind her, his face pale and his posture defensive. They had tracked my location using the GPS signal on my cell phone. Heather scanned the room, her eyes locking onto my booth. She crossed the diner with furious purpose, completely ignoring the startled glances of the few patrons eating their late breakfast. She stopped directly in front of my table, placing her designer handbag down with a loud thud. Heather reached into her bag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She slammed the papers down right on top of the forged loan agreement I was reviewing. She leaned over the table, her face twisting into a mask of pure condescension. She did not bother lowering her voice. She wanted an audience. "You need to sign this quitclaim deed right now, Jameson," Heather demanded loudly, her voice echoing off the tiled walls. "You are holding up the final equity release. We need that money to clear the liens on the estate before the developer's deadline on Friday. I looked at the document she presented. It was a complete surrender of my remaining legal rights to the property, transferring total ownership directly into Damon and Ebony's control. It was the final nail in my financial coffin. I looked past Heather to my son. Damon stood silently, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He refused to meet my eyes, staring intently at a stain on the floor. He was allowing his wife to publicly humiliate his own father in a crowded diner. The boy I had taught to stand tall and defend his family was now cowering behind a woman who viewed us both as expendable assets. "I am not signing anything," I stated calmly, folding my hands over the forged loan document to conceal the details. "I am reviewing my options." Heather let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She slammed her hands flat against the table. "You do not have options, old man. You are completely delusional. If you do not sign this deed right this second, I will call Adult Protective Services. I will tell them you are wandering the streets of the industrial district in a state of severe dementia. I will have you committed to a locked psychiatric ward before the sun goes down. Do you understand me? You will sign this paper, or you will spend the rest of your pathetic life heavily medicated in a state facility." Her threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The waitress behind the counter stopped wiping the coffee machine, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Several patrons muttered among themselves. Heather enjoyed the spectacle. She thrived on the absolute control she believed she wielded over me. She thought she had completely cornered a fragile, helpless widower. She failed to comprehend that she was dealing with a man who had spent 40 years designing complex structural systems specifically built to withstand catastrophic pressure. I looked at the quitclaim deed. I looked at the aggressive, threatening posture of the woman trying to steal my life's work. I looked at my son, whose silence finalized his treason. Fighting them in this diner would accomplish nothing. Denying the signature would only provoke them to forge it later, just as they had done with the offshore loan. I needed them to believe they had won. I needed them to take this specific document to the bank. I needed an undeniable physical record of their coercion. "Hand me the pen," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Heather smirked, a triumphant gleam lighting up her eyes. She pulled a gold-plated pen from her purse and practically shoved it into my hand. Damon finally looked up, letting out a long, audible sigh of profound relief. They believed I had broken. They believed the threat of an institution had finally crushed my spirit. I took the gold pen. I did not use my dominant right hand. I shifted my weight, slightly transferring the pen to my left hand. I gripped the smooth metal awkwardly. I leaned over the quitclaim deed and slowly, deliberately signed my name on the bottom line. The signature was jagged, uncoordinated, and fundamentally different from every legal document I had signed over the past 4 decades. It was the handwriting of a man under extreme duress, entirely inconsistent with my established biometric signature. It was completely legally invalid. Heather snatched the paper off the table the exact second the pen lifted from the page. She did not bother to examine the signature closely. She only saw the ink. She shoved the deed into her handbag, her posture instantly shifting from aggressive intimidation to dismissive arrogance. "You made the right choice, Jameson," she sneered, turning on her heel. "Enjoy your coffee." She marched out of the diner, the bell ringing violently once again. Damon lingered for a fraction of a second. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words died in his throat. He turned and followed his wife out into the cold morning air, leaving his father sitting alone in a cheap booth. I watched them speed out of the parking lot. I placed the gold pen down next to my coffee cup. I picked up the forged offshore loan document and folded it carefully, sliding it securely into my inner jacket pocket. Heather thought she had secured the final key to liquidating the estate. She did not realize she had just walked out with a useless piece of paper that would serve as Exhibit A in a federal coercion case. I finished my lukewarm coffee. The trap was set. The first domino had fallen exactly where I needed it to land. I stood up, left a $5 bill on the table, and walked out of the diner. It was time to visit my attorney. I walked 4 blocks in the biting wind before hailing a second taxi. I gave the driver the address for the towering glass monolith dominating the downtown financial district. Aaron worked on the 42nd floor. He was not a cheap family attorney. Aaron was a ruthless corporate litigator who specialized in hostile takeovers and complex asset protection. I had retained his firm decades ago when I first launched my logistics company. He knew the absolute scale of the wealth Coretta and I had accumulated. He also knew the precise limitations of my children's intellect. The receptionist recognized me instantly and ushered me past the waiting area directly into Aaron's corner office. Aaron stood behind a massive mahogany desk. He took one look at my posture and immediately closed the heavy oak door, sealing us in complete privacy. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I reached into my jacket and placed the folded offshore loan document onto the polished wood. Next to it, I placed a high-resolution photograph I had taken of the quitclaim deed right before Heather snatched it from the diner table. Aaron picked up the loan document first. His sharp eyes scanned the dense legal text. He saw the $2 million principal. He saw the Cayman Islands routing information. Then he looked at the signatures at the bottom. He noted the clumsy forgery of my name resting right beside the signatures of Heather and Brent. He set the paper down and picked up the photograph of the quitclaim deed. He immediately noticed the stark difference in the penmanship. I explained the confrontation at the diner. I detailed how Heather threatened me with adult protective services and forced the signature. I explained that I deliberately used my left hand to render the legal consent entirely invalid. Aaron leaned back in his leather chair. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He praised the tactical brilliance of the left-handed signature. It was a completely deniable mark that simultaneously proved coercion. If they tried to file it with the county clerk, it would instantly trigger a massive fraud alert. However, Aaron's smile vanished when he returned his attention to the offshore loan. He typed furiously on his secure terminal, accessing commercial real estate databases and running the routing numbers printed on the foreign document. He pulled up a shadow ledger and cross-referenced the property identification numbers. The color drained slightly from his face. He turned his monitor around so I could see the screen. Aaron revealed the full, terrifying scope of their plan. Damon and Ebony were not just trying to steal the equity of the estate to pay off their bankrupt businesses. They were brokering a massive finalized sale to a luxury commercial developer. The developer intended to bulldoze the property and build a high-end retail complex. The sale was already in escrow. The closing date was set for exactly 10 days from today. The mechanics of their treason were brutally simple. The $2 million offshore loan was a bridge maneuver. Heather and Brent had used the forged document to secure immediate, untraceable cash to appease Damon and Ebony's most aggressive creditors. When the estate officially sold to the commercial developer in 10 days, the massive payout would theoretically clear the offshore lien. But Aaron pointed out a fatal discrepancy in their wire instructions. The escrow payout was not routed to clear the debt. It was routed directly into a series of scrambled international accounts. If they succeeded, the developer would take the land. The millions in profit would vanish completely overseas. The offshore lending entity would instantly default on the $2 million bridge loan. Because my forged signature was on the original collateral document, the federal government and the international creditors would hold me entirely responsible. I would be legally buried in federal debt, facing absolute bankruptcy and potential criminal charges for international fraud. The children had orchestrated a perfect frame-up. They were using my identity as a human shield for their grand larceny. Aaron stood up and began pacing the length of his office. He stated that we needed to file a quiet legal injunction immediately. By filing a sealed motion with a federal judge, we could freeze the escrow account the exact second the developer transferred the funds. The children would believe the sale had gone through smoothly. They would wait for the money to hit their offshore accounts. It never would. The trap would snap shut, locking them in a federal financial holding pattern that they could not escape. I agreed with the strategy. It was a flawless countermeasure. It allowed them to commit the crime fully before dropping the anvil on their heads. I watched Aaron pull out a fresh legal pad and begin drafting the injunction documents. He asked me for the original serial numbers of my business patents. I had transferred the core intellectual property of my logistics systems into a private trust years ago. I kept the physical notarized copies in a secure, climate-controlled storage unit across town. Those documents were the absolute bedrock of my wealth. They were the undeniable proof of my entire life's work. I reached into my pocket to retrieve my phone to access the storage unit's digital vault code. As my fingers brushed the cold screen, the device vibrated violently. It was a sustained, aggressive buzzing that cut through the quiet calm of the law office. I pulled the phone out and looked at the display. It was an automated alert from the private security firm that monitored my storage facility. A thermal alarm had been triggered. The bold red text on the screen indicated a severe temperature spike in Unit 402. That was my exact unit. I opened the security application and accessed the live feed from the hallway camera outside my locker. Smoke was already billowing from beneath the rolling steel door. The bright orange glow of an active fire reflected off the polished concrete floor. The sprinkler system had been manually disabled. I watched the timestamp tick forward as the fire consumed the interior of the unit. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The children were not just stealing my money, they were systematically destroying my history. That unit did not just hold my business patents and corporate ledgers. It held Coretta's physical photo albums. It held the fragile, irreplaceable letters we had written to each other when we were young and impoverished. It held the only remaining tangible proof of the life we had built together before the wealth had poisoned our offspring. Damon and Ebony were burning it all to ashes. They were eradicating my legacy to ensure I had no emotional or legal anchor left in this world. They wanted to erase my existence completely, leaving behind only the debt they had saddled to my name. I stared at the black smoke filling the digital screen. The cold anger inside me crystallized into something far more dangerous. It became absolute ruthless resolve. Filing a legal injunction from a high-rise office was no longer sufficient. Fighting them from a distance was too slow and entirely too passive. They were burning my past. I needed to infiltrate their present. I looked up at Aaron. He had stopped writing. He saw the expression on my face and asked what had happened. I turned the phone screen toward him so he could witness the destruction of my legacy. I told him to hold the injunction. I told him that trapping them on paper was not enough anymore. I needed physical access to the estate. I needed the encrypted offshore banking tokens that Coretta had hidden in the false bottom of the desk in my old study. Without those tokens, I could not trace the final destination of the stolen funds. I picked up my jacket and walked toward the heavy oak door. Aaron warned me that stepping foot on the property would give them the opportunity to escalate their physical threats. I told him I was counting on it. They believed I was a broken, exiled old man. I was going to give them exactly the performance they expected. I was going to use their overwhelming arrogance as the ultimate Trojan horse. I stepped out of the office and headed straight into the storm. I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of the legal building and walked directly into the freezing storm. The sky had turned a bruised, violent shade of violet, unleashing a torrential downpour that instantly soaked through my thin wool coat. I did not hail a taxi. I needed to arrive at the estate looking completely broken. I walked the final 3 miles through the affluent suburban streets. The icy rain battered my face and numbed my fingers. My expensive leather dress shoes filled with freezing water. Every step was a calculated physical sacrifice designed to build a flawless illusion. I needed my children to look at me and see a defeated, helpless victim. I needed their immense arrogance to blind them to the trap I was actively walking into. Fighting them through the slow channels of the legal system was no longer a viable option. Aaron could freeze the escrow accounts, but he could not prevent Damon and Ebony from liquidating the physical assets inside the house or fleeing the country with their initial offshore loan cash. I needed absolute proximity. I needed to infiltrate the very fortress I had built. Specifically, I needed access to my old study on the 2nd floor. I had spent decades designing secure data infrastructure for international logistics firms. I never trusted cloud storage for my most sensitive personal data. The digital tokens required to trace and intercept the offshore banking routes were encoded on physical hardware drives. Coretta had meticulously hidden those drives inside a customized false compartment beneath the floorboards of my study. Without those tokens, I could not track the stolen $2 million. I approached the massive wrought iron gates at the entrance of the long driveway. I had installed these security gates myself. I knew the physical infrastructure of this property better than any blueprint. I walked up the winding path as the storm intensified. I reached the massive mahogany front doors. My teeth chattered uncontrollably from the biting cold. My clothes clung heavily to my shivering frame. I raised my fist and struck the thick wood. I waited in the freezing downpour. The porch light flicked on, casting a harsh yellow glare over my drenched figure. The deadbolt clicked. The heavy door swung inward. Ebony stood in the grand foyer. She wore a pristine cashmere sweater and held a crystal wine glass. Her initial expression of shock rapidly warped into a sneer of profound disgust. She looked at me as if a stray dog had wandered onto her manicured lawn. I immediately dropped my shoulders, curving my spine to appear smaller and much more fragile. I initiated a deep, rattling cough that echoed loudly in the cavernous entryway. I let my hands shake violently, mimicking a severe neurological tremor. I looked up at my daughter through rain-soaked eyelashes and begged her for a place to sleep. I told her the downtown homeless shelters were completely full. I told her the bank teller had confiscated my debit card. I stripped away every ounce of my patriarchal dignity and pleaded for basic mercy. Ebony did not flinch. She took a step backward, terrified that my wet clothes might stain the expensive Persian rug. She coldly informed me that I was trespassing and reached for her cellular phone to dial the local police precinct. Brent stepped out from the formal dining room, intercepting her hand. He wore my vintage velvet smoking jacket over his clothes. He looked at my shivering, pathetic display and smirked. Brent was a coward, but he possessed a highly predatory cunning. He realized the inherent danger of casting me out into the street. He lowered his voice, speaking quickly to Ebony. I strained my ears to catch his frantic whispers over the sound of the pouring rain. Brent argued that throwing me out was a massive strategic error. If I collapsed on a public sidewalk, a hospital social worker or a state-appointed legal aid attorney might take up my case. An independent investigation could easily expose their forged medical power of attorney before the commercial developer finalized the estate purchase. Brent explicitly pointed out that the escrow deadline was exactly 10 days away. They needed absolute silence and total control until the wire transfer cleared international waters. Keeping me entirely isolated on the property eliminated the risk of external interference. Ebony slowly lowered her phone, her eyes narrowing as she processed the cruel logic of her husband's argument. She nodded once. Brent turned back to face me, his chest puffed out with arrogant authority. He pointed a long, manicured finger toward the darkness of the backyard. He told me I was strictly forbidden from entering the main house. He announced that I could sleep on the damp concrete floor of the abandoned pool house until the end of the week. I bowed my head and offered a trembling, pathetic whisper of gratitude. Brent snatched a heavy brass key from the entryway table and stepped out into the freezing rain to escort me. He did not offer me an umbrella. He marched quickly across the manicured lawn, leaving me to stumble and drag my heavy feet through the pooling mud behind him. We reached the small detached structure at the far edge of the property. I had constructed this pool house the summer before Ebony turned 16. I had wired the secondary electrical grid with my own hands to ensure the main house would never lose power during her extravagant parties. My knowledge of this structure was absolute. The pool house had been completely neglected since Coretta first fell ill. The exterior paint was peeling and the windows were dark and covered in thick grime. Brent shoved the key into the rusty deadbolt and kicked the heavy door open. A wave of stale, moldy air washed over my face. The interior was pitch black and freezing. Brent did not bother reaching for the light switch. He pointed into the gloom and ordered me inside. I shuffled slowly past him, keeping my head down and my hands shaking violently. I stepped onto the cold concrete floor. Brent grabbed the heavy metal handle and slammed the door shut behind me. I heard the sharp metallic scrape of the deadbolt locking from the outside. I heard his heavy footsteps squelching through the mud as he sprinted back to the warmth and luxury of my stolen home. I stood perfectly still in the absolute darkness. I waited until I could no longer hear the sound of his receding footsteps over the relentless pounding of the rain against the roof. The second I was entirely alone, my violent shivering stopped completely. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back to relieve the tension of my calculated performance. My breathing leveled out into a slow, measured rhythm. I allowed my eyes to adjust to the total gloom. The faint ambient light from the distant street lamps filtered through the dirty skylight, illuminating the neglected wreckage of the room. I walked confidently across the familiar layout of the floor plan, easily avoiding a shattered glass table and a pile of discarded pool floats. I found a broken plastic lawn chair resting in the corner and sat down. The damp air gnawed at my bones, but the cold did not matter. I reached down and picked up the black plastic garbage bag Brent had mockingly given me earlier that morning. I did not open the top. I turned the bag completely upside down. I dug my fingers into the thick, reinforced plastic lining at the very bottom. I ripped the false seam open with a sharp tear. I reached into the hidden compartment and pulled out a small military-grade encrypted laptop. I flipped the durable metal screen open. The keyboard illuminated immediately, casting a sharp, pale blue glow across my face. The battery icon displayed a full charge. I typed in my complex alphanumeric password and watched the operating system boot up rapidly. I looked around the freezing, locked cage my children thought would hold me. A slow, grim smile spread across my face. I was invisible. I was securely positioned directly behind enemy lines. I was exactly where I needed to be. The pale blue light of the laptop screen illuminated the freezing damp walls of the pool house. My breath plumed in the freezing air, but my hands were completely steady. I rested the heavy machine on my knees and initiated the primary boot sequence. Damon and Ebony believed they had isolated me by cutting the physical power lines to this structure. They failed to realize I did not need their electricity. My device ran on an independent military-grade power cell, and my objective did not require physical force. It required access. I opened the network terminal and began scanning the immediate wireless frequencies. The main house router appeared instantly. Damon had predictably changed the administrative passwords the moment he locked me out. He likely felt a profound sense of security knowing he had changed a few default settings on a commercial router. Damon was a failed tech entrepreneur who relied on expensive consultants to build his software. He lacked fundamental foundational knowledge. I did not. Long before I built my logistics empire, I spent 20 years designing and stress testing the internal network security architectures for international banking conglomerates. I built digital fortresses designed to withstand state-sponsored cyber warfare. Bypassing a residential broadband connection was not even a challenge. It was a basic exercise. I typed a string of command prompts into the terminal. When I originally wired the main house 30 years ago, I embedded a hard-coded physical backdoor directly into the network framework. It was a fail-safe I designed to ensure I could always monitor the integrity of my property. I initiated the override protocol. The system bypassed Damon's amateur security firewall in exactly 42 seconds. I was completely inside the central network. I deployed a packet sniffer program to silently capture and duplicate every single piece of digital traffic flowing through the estate. I isolated the specific media access control addresses tied to Damon's personal laptop and Ebony's cellular device. I sat in the absolute dark, surrounded by shattered glass and broken pool equipment, and I began to read my children's private communications. I expected to find them aggressively coordinating the final details of the estate sale. I expected to see unified legal strategies designed to completely neutralize my presence. Instead, I uncovered a terrifying dynamic of absolute dysfunction. The united front they presented at my wife's funeral and in the diner was a complete and utter illusion. I intercepted a massive chain of heavily encrypted emails originating from Damon's laptop. I broke the encryption key with a simple brute force algorithm. The emails were not directed to the commercial developer or to their lawyers. They were drafted by Heather. She was actively dictating instructions to my son. I read the vicious words glowing on my screen. Heather explicitly demanded that Damon alter the final routing numbers for the escrow payout. She wrote that Ebony was useless dead weight who contributed absolutely nothing to the family. She instructed Damon to funnel the entire multi-million-dollar payout from the commercial developer directly into a secondary shell account exclusively under Damon's name. Heather was aggressively manipulating my son to completely cut his own sister out of the final sale. I minimized the email client and shifted my attention to the cellular text logs originating from Ebony's phone. The data stream revealed a simultaneous parallel conspiracy. I pulled up a lengthy, ongoing text conversation between Ebony and Brent. Brent was actively poisoning my daughter against her brother. Brent detailed a ruthless, calculating legal strategy to invoke an emergency psychiatric hold on Damon. He provided Ebony with documented proof of Damon's hidden massive sports gambling debts. Brent instructed Ebony to use those gambling debts as definitive proof of total financial and mental incompetence. He demanded that Ebony file for sole legal conservatorship over Damon before the commercial developer finalized the property purchase next Friday. Brent wanted Ebony to declare her brother legally insane so she could seize total control of the inheritance. I stared at the glowing screen as the sheer malice of the situation crystallized in my mind. Damon and Ebony were not actually united in their treason against me. They were completely isolated from one another, utterly blinded by their own greed and profound desperation. They were being entirely controlled by their respective spouses. Heather and Brent were systematically playing the siblings against each other. The white in-laws were engaging in a vicious proxy war using my children as expendable pawns to steal the entire fortune. They were actively tearing my family apart from the inside out. I leaned back in the broken plastic lawn chair. The damp cold of the pool house seeped into my bones, but my focus remained razor sharp. I continued sifting through the raw data stream, digging deeper into the background network traffic. The localized communications between the spouses were damning, but my decades of systems analysis taught me to always look for the hidden anomalies. I scanned the outbound international data packets. I noticed a highly unusual file transfer occurring in the background. It was a heavily encrypted folder buried deep within the network cache, intentionally masked under the guise of an innocuous system update file. The file originated from a shared internet protocol address tied to the guest suite in the main house. I isolated the masked folder and dragged it onto my secure desktop. The encryption was significantly more sophisticated than Damon's amateur network security. It utilized a rolling cipher. I launched a specialized decryption sequence I had developed years ago for corporate espionage audits. The progress bar crawled slowly across the bottom of the screen. I sat in the freezing darkness listening to the relentless rain pound against the roof of the pool house. I did not move. I did not blink. I waited with the absolute patience of a hunter observing a trap. The progress bar reached 100%. A green confirmation prompt illuminated my face. The folder unlocked. I double-clicked the icon and opened the contents. It was not a banking document. It was not a forged legal deed or a fake medical power of attorney. It was a digital itinerary. It was a confirmed booking for 2 first-class airline tickets. I read the passenger names printed on the digital confirmation document. The tickets were booked under the names Heather and Brent. I read the final destination, Paris, France. I checked the departure date and the exact boarding time. The flight was scheduled to leave the international airport exactly 2 hours after the commercial developer was legally contracted to finalize the multi-million-dollar purchase of my estate next Friday afternoon. The final crushing piece of the puzzle locked firmly into place. Heather and Brent were not fighting a proxy war against each other. The vicious advice they were feeding to Damon and Ebony was a completely coordinated distraction. Heather and Brent were secretly working together. They were actively orchestrating the mutual destruction of my children. They planned to let Damon and Ebony completely annihilate each other in civil and family court. While the siblings fought for control of the fraudulent funds, Heather and Brent intended to intercept the entire $2 million offshore payout. They planned to steal the money together and immediately flee the country, completely abandoning both Damon and Ebony to face the inevitable federal fraud charges alone. The White in-laws intended to leave my children penniless, facing federal prison while they lived in absolute luxury overseas. I closed the itinerary file. I shut the heavy metal lid of the laptop. The darkness returned to the freezing pool house. I sat in the pitch black and allowed myself a slow, dangerous smile. They believed they were brilliant architects of deception. They did not realize they had just handed the master blueprint directly to the engineer. The pale blue light of the laptop screen faded into absolute black as I powered down the device. I slid the encrypted machine back into the false bottom of the garbage bag, just as the sound of heavy tires crunching on wet gravel pierced the morning silence. The freezing rain from the previous night had settled into a dense, bone-chilling fog that blanketed the entire estate. Heavy footsteps approached the pool house. The rusty deadbolt scraped loudly against the metal strike plate. The door swung open, letting in a sharp draft of frigid air. Heather stood in the doorway. She was wearing a pristine white trench coat and a pair of oversized designer sunglasses despite the heavy overcast sky. A man stood directly beside her. He was tall, slightly overweight, and wore a poorly tailored gray suit beneath a transparent rain poncho. He clutched a worn leather medical bag in his right hand. I remained seated on the broken plastic lawn chair in the darkest corner of the room. I instantly dropped my shoulders, curved my spine, and allowed my hands to shake. I widened my eyes, projecting a look of profound, helpless confusion. Heather did not bother to greet me. She stepped into the damp room, wrinkling her nose in absolute disgust at the smell of mildew and stale water. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. She told the man in the gray suit that I had been wandering around the property all morning, mumbling incoherent sentences. She claimed I had completely forgotten my late wife was dead. It was a flawless, rehearsed lie. The man stepped forward. He introduced himself as Dr. Aris. He did not ask for my permission to begin a medical evaluation. He simply pulled a thick stack of paperwork from his leather bag and clicked his pen. Dr. Aris did not look at me with the compassionate gaze of a medical professional. He looked at me with the cold, calculating eyes of a mercenary fulfilling a lucrative contract. He stood over me, utilizing his physical height to establish immediate intimidation. During my years negotiating complex international logistics contracts, I had dealt with corrupt port authorities and bribed customs officials across 3 continents. I knew exactly how a man looked when he was operating entirely outside the boundaries of the law. Dr. Aris was not here to evaluate my cognitive function. He was here to legally erase it. He began firing questions at a rapid, aggressive pace. He demanded to know the current day of the week. He asked for the full name of the current president. He asked me to count backward from 100 by increments of 7. The questions were intentionally designed to induce panic and severe confusion in an elderly patient. I leaned completely into my performance. I let my jaw hang slightly slack. I blinked rapidly, shifting my gaze between the doctor and Heather like a frightened child seeking reassurance from a hostile parent. I stuttered through the first few answers. I provided the wrong day of the week. I deliberately gave the name of a president who had been out of office for over a decade. I attempted to count backward, but intentionally lost my place after 3 numbers, letting my voice trail off into a pathetic, frustrated whisper. Heather stood by the door, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She let out a loud, theatrical sigh. She loudly lamented how tragic it was to watch a once brilliant man lose his entire mind to the ravages of severe dementia. She was building a narrative file, laying the verbal groundwork to justify her absolute control over my estate. Dr. Eris nodded sympathetically, playing his part flawlessly in the twisted theater production. The doctor crouched down slightly to bring his face level with mine. He asked me for my exact date of birth. This was the baseline standard for establishing fundamental orientation to reality. I stared at him blankly. I forced my hands to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. I reached up and rubbed my temples, mimicking the physical agony of a broken mind trying to grasp a fleeting memory. I opened my mouth and gave him the year Damon was born instead of my own. I immediately corrected myself, frantically substituting the year Coretta and I were married. I let genuine tears well up in my eyes, utilizing the raw, agonizing grief over my wife's passing to fuel the physical manifestation of my fake mental collapse. I begged the doctor to tell me where Coretta had gone. I asked why she had not brought me my morning coffee. Heather stepped forward and placed a hand on the doctor's shoulder. She shook her head sadly. She told him that I had been completely detached from reality since the funeral. She declared that I was an active danger to myself and an unbearable financial and emotional burden on my grieving children. Dr. Eris stood up slowly. He offered Heather a deeply fake look of professional pity. He stated that the evaluation was conclusively finished. He confirmed that I was suffering from advanced cognitive decline and required immediate round-the-clock custodial care. He did not say another word to me. He turned his back on my shivering form. He and Heather walked out of the pool house together. Heather pulled the door shut, leaving it slightly ajar in her haste to escape the damp, miserable environment. I remained slumped in the broken chair until I heard their footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway outside. I stood up silently. My spine straightened instantly. The violent tremor in my hands vanished completely. I wiped the tears from my face, replacing the mask of grief with absolute, unwavering resolve. I walked with silent, measured steps toward the cracked window facing the main driveway. I peered through the dirty glass. Heather and Dr. Eris stood beside her luxury sport utility vehicle. The morning fog swirled thick around their ankles. Dr. Eris placed his thick stack of medical paperwork directly onto the damp hood of Heather's car. He clicked his pen and signed his name with a swift, practiced motion. It was a preliminary certificate of absolute mental incompetence. That single document gave Ebony and Damon the legal ammunition required to seize my assets permanently and finalize the sale to the commercial developer. However, Dr. Eris did not hand the paper over immediately. He kept his heavy hand firmly planted on the document. He leaned in close to Heather and demanded his final compensation. He explicitly requested $10,000 in untraceable cash. He reminded her of the immense legal risk he was undertaking by falsifying a psychiatric evaluation that could strip a man of his basic human rights. Heather laughed, a sharp, arrogant sound that pierced the heavy fog. She promised him the cash would be delivered the exact moment the commercial developer wired the final escrow payment for the estate. She snatched the signed certificate from under his hand and climbed into the driver's seat. Dr. Eris walked toward his own vehicle. I stepped back from the window. I reached deep into the breast pocket of my damp shirt. I pulled out a highly sensitive military-grade audio recording device. A tiny red light blinked steadily on the top edge. I had engaged the recording function the exact second I heard the rusty deadbolt turn. I captured every single humiliating question. I captured every fake sigh of pity. I captured the crystal-clear audio of Dr. Eris negotiating his cash bribe with Heather outside in the driveway. The White in-laws believed they were securing a legal victory to facilitate their escape to Paris. They had no idea they were actively building my federal extortion case. 3 days after the corrupt doctor signed away my cognitive rights on the hood of a luxury vehicle, my estate was transformed into a grotesque theater of wealth. Damon and Ebony were hosting a lavish charity gala. The philanthropic theme was a transparent masquerade. The exclusive guest list was heavily curated for a single defining purpose: They needed to thoroughly impress the commercial developer purchasing the property. The escrow deadline was looming. They needed the developer to feel completely confident in the prestige and absolute security of his imminent multi-million-dollar acquisition. A fleet of catering vans arrived at dawn, unloading towering floral arrangements and crates of imported champagne. A string quartet tuned their instruments in the grand ballroom. I watched the frantic preparations from the cracked window of the pool house. My children were sparing no expense to celebrate a fortune they had not yet officially stolen. Shortly before the first luxury sedans rolled up the long driveway, the heavy door of the pool house swung open. Damon stepped inside. He held a cheap, ill-fitting polyester vest and a pair of worn black slacks. He threw the crumpled garments directly onto my broken lawn chair. He commanded me to put them on immediately. He announced that I would be working as the primary coat check attendant for the evening. It was a deliberate, highly calculated attempt to crush whatever lingering pride I possessed. My children wanted the man who built this magnificent estate to stand in the foyer like a lowly servant forced to bow and scrape before the very people purchasing his stolen legacy. I did not argue. I did not protest. I slowly stripped off my damp clothes and pulled the cheap uniform over my shivering frame. I kept my head bowed. Damon sneered at my apparent submission and marched me toward the main house. The grand foyer was flooded with brilliant golden light. I took my position behind a temporary wooden counter stationed near the heavy mahogany front doors. The influx of guests began at exactly 7 o'clock. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in shimmering evening gowns flooded into the entryway. They handed me their heavy wool overcoats, damp from the persistent winter drizzle. They looked right through me. I was completely invisible to them. I was merely an extension of the furniture, an automated mechanism designed to hold their expensive garments. I accepted each coat with trembling, submissive hands. I meticulously hung them on the long metal racks lining the makeshift cloakroom. The sheer volume of arriving guests created a minor bottleneck at the front door. Ebony noticed the slight delay and immediately crossed the foyer. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor. She leaned over the wooden counter, her face contorted with embarrassment. She hissed brutal, venomous insults directly into my ear. She called me a pathetic, useless cripple. She demanded that I move my trembling hands faster, threatening to throw me back out into the freezing rain if I ruined her flawless first impression. Damon walked past a few minutes later, escorting a local politician. He paused just long enough to purposefully bump his shoulder hard against my chest, knocking me off balance. He told me to stop dragging my feet like a dying animal. Their cruelty was relentless. It was also entirely expected. I absorbed every vicious word and every physical shove with complete internal tranquility. My mind was completely insulated against their pathetic attempts at psychological torture. The front doors opened again, admitting Heather and Brent. They had arrived separately from my children, portraying themselves as supportive extended family members attending the philanthropic event. Heather wore a stunning emerald dress and Brent sported a sharply tailored charcoal suit. They stepped up to the coat check counter. They handed me their heavy winter trench coats. Heather did not even bother to look at my face. She simply dropped the heavy fabric onto the counter and turned away, laughing loudly at a joke Brent had just whispered. I took their coats and carried them to the very back of the dark cloakroom. I hung the garments on a secluded rack. I stopped shaking. I reached into the deep pocket of my cheap polyester trousers. I pulled out 2 micro GPS tracking chips. They were the size of small coins, utilizing encrypted cellular networks to broadcast real-time location data with pinpoint military-grade accuracy. I had activated them inside the pool house utilizing my secure laptop terminal. I slipped my hand into the silk lining of Heather's emerald coat. I pushed the tiny tracker deep into a tiny tear in the inner pocket seam, ensuring it would never be discovered during a casual search. I repeated the exact same process with Brent's charcoal trench coat. My children believed their spouses were fiercely loyal allies in the battle for the estate. They were entirely oblivious to the one-way airline tickets to Paris currently sitting in Heather's digital inbox. Heather and Brent planned to intercept the massive wire transfer the exact second the developer cleared the funds next Friday. They were going to board an international flight and abandon Damon and Ebony to face the crushing federal fallout alone. I could not allow the white in-laws to vanish into the European wind. The micro-trackers guaranteed that I would know their exact geographic coordinates the second they attempted to flee. I smoothed the fabric of their coats and walked back to the front counter, resuming my pathetic, trembling posture. The flow of guests eventually slowed, transitioning into the grand ballroom for the primary reception. I remained stationed in the quiet foyer. 30 minutes later, the heavy mahogany doors swung open one final time. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped into the entryway. I recognized his face immediately from the extensive dossier Aaron had compiled. It was Marcus Sterling, the ruthless commercial luxury developer brokering the purchase of my estate. Damon rushed out of the ballroom to greet him personally. Damon's face was flushed with frantic, desperate excitement. He offered Sterling a glass of vintage champagne and attempted to usher him toward the main event. Sterling held up a hand, refusing the drink. He did not look impressed by the extravagant floral arrangements or the string quartet playing in the background. His expression was stern and deeply irritated. He pulled a folded legal document from his breast pocket. I stood silently in the shadows of the coat room, listening intently to their hushed, urgent conversation. Sterling bluntly informed my son that his legal team had flagged a massive discrepancy during their preliminary title search. He stated that a massive $2 million offshore lien had suddenly materialized on the property records. He demanded an immediate, flawless explanation. He explicitly warned Damon that his firm would absolutely not proceed with the multi-million-dollar purchase if the property title was not entirely clear of all outstanding international debt. Damon panicked. The color instantly drained from his face. The bridge loan he and Ebony had secured using my forged signature was supposed to remain entirely hidden until the escrow funds cleared. He scrambled to salvage the crumbling deal. He lied with smooth, practiced desperation. He swore to Sterling that the offshore lien was a simple clerical error committed by an incompetent junior accountant. He promised the developer that his attorneys were already resolving the minor paperwork glitch. He guaranteed the title would be perfectly immaculate before the scheduled closing date on Friday. Sterling narrowed his eyes, clearly unconvinced by Damon's frantic reassurances. He demanded ironclad notarized proof of the title clearance by the end of the week. Damon nodded aggressively, promising to deliver the documents. The tension in the foyer was palpable. Damon was inches away from losing the entire fortune. I looked at the two men standing on the pristine marble floor. I looked at the tray of red wine resting on the catering cart abandoned near the cloakroom entrance. I recognized the absolute necessity of a strategic delay. If Sterling pushed the escrow closing back, Damon and Ebony would miss the deadline to appease their most violent corporate creditors. Heather and Brent would miss their meticulously scheduled flight to Paris. The entire fragile ecosystem of their treason would collapse under the weight of a simple scheduling error. I stepped out from the shadows of the coat room. I picked up the silver tray holding 6 full glasses of dark, heavy red wine. I engaged my violent, full-body tremor. I shuffled out into the center of the foyer directly toward the developer and my son. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the floor, playing the role of a confused, terrified old servant. I timed my approach flawlessly. As Sterling turned on his heel to walk toward the ballroom, I stepped directly into his path. I deliberately shifted my weight, lunging forward with calculated clumsiness. I violently tilted the silver tray. The heavy crystal glasses shattered against the marble floor. A massive wave of dark crimson wine splashed directly across the front of Sterling's impeccably tailored trousers and completely soaked his expensive custom-made leather shoes. The developer erupted. He screamed in pure, unadulterated anger. He looked down at his ruined garments and unleashed a furious barrage of profanity. Damon gasped in sheer horror, lunging forward to brush the wine off the furious man. Sterling shoved my son away violently. He glared at Damon with absolute venom. He declared the entire evening a catastrophic disaster. He announced that he was leaving the property immediately to consult with his legal team regarding the offshore lien. He explicitly stated that the closing date was officially postponed until further notice. Sterling turned and stormed out of the front doors, slamming them violently behind him. Damon stood frozen in the center of the ruined foyer, staring at the spreading puddle of red wine and shattered glass. His chest heaved with panic. The developer was gone. The sale was delayed. I stood quietly in the corner, clutching the empty silver tray with trembling hands. My head remained bowed in mock terror, but my eyes were perfectly clear. I had just bought myself crucial days. The final countdown had officially commenced. The screeching tires of the developer's departing vehicle signaled the complete collapse of my son's financial lifeline. Damon stood paralyzed, staring at the pool of dark crimson wine and shattered crystal on the white marble. The surrounding guests fell into a stunned, suffocating silence. The multi-million-dollar sale was indefinitely delayed, and Damon's meticulously constructed facade was rapidly disintegrating. He slowly turned his head, his furious eyes locking onto me. I remained hunched in the corner, clutching the empty silver tray, my hands vibrating with a manufactured tremor. Damon did not see a fragile father. He saw the immediate scapegoat for his catastrophic failure. His face flushed a mottled red as he crossed the foyer with heavy predatory strides. Ignoring the sophisticated audience watching him, he grabbed the collar of my cheap polyester uniform vest and twisted the fabric tightly, cutting off my air. Damon hauled me forward with brutal, unhinged physical force, dragging me past the terrified coat check line and shoving me violently through the side service exit. The transition from the opulent gala to the freezing storm outside was instantaneous. The icy downpour battered my face and completely soaked my thin uniform. Damon maintained his iron grip, marching aggressively across the dark lawn. My shoes slipped and dragged through the deep mud. I did not resist his physical assault. I allowed my body to go entirely limp, forcing him to bear my dead weight. Every time I stumbled, he yanked me upward with a vicious curse. I played the broken victim flawlessly, letting out weak coughs swallowed by the howling wind. Damon believed he was exercising absolute authority over a defeated old man. He failed to comprehend that his physical violence was a direct manifestation of profound weakness. A man in control of his destiny does not drag his elderly father through the mud in a winter storm. He was breaking, and I was analyzing every single fracture in his psychological armor. We reached the isolated perimeter of the estate where the abandoned pool house loomed in the darkness. Damon shoved me hard against the wet wood of the pool house door. I collapsed onto the freezing concrete, deliberately scraping my palms to complete the illusion of utter helplessness. He kicked the door open, dragged me inside by my shoulder, and threw me forcefully onto the damp floorboards. The heavy scent of mold filled the freezing air. Damon paced the small dark room like a trapped animal. The ambient light from distant security lamps cast jagged shadows across his furious face. He finally unleashed the toxic reservoir of resentment he had harbored for decades. He screamed that I had never been a good father. He shouted that my relentless obsession with building my logistics empire had completely neglected him and his sister. His voice echoed violently off the rotting walls as he pointed a trembling finger at my face. He declared that my entire life amounted to absolutely nothing but building a massive house that I could not even keep. He blamed me for the financial ruin he had brought upon himself through reckless arrogance and hidden gambling addictions. I sat on the freezing concrete, keeping my head bowed and my shoulders shaking. I absorbed every venomous insult with complete internal tranquility. His words meant nothing to me. They were the desperate lies of a man realizing the trap was closing. Damon's screaming eventually tapered off into exhausted panting. Looking down at me with pure contempt, he announced he could not risk me ruining another crucial interaction. He declared I would remain locked in this freezing squalor until the commercial developer returned to sign the escrow paperwork. He turned toward the small electrical panel mounted near the heavy reinforced door, which controlled the secondary power grid I had personally installed 30 years ago. Damon grabbed the main heavy-duty power cable leading directly into the breaker box. He pulled a pocket knife from his trousers and violently severed the thick black cord. The faint hum of the standby generator died instantly. He ripped the severed wires from the wall, plunging the entire structure into absolute blackness. He intended to leave his 69-year-old father in the freezing damp without any source of light, heat, or communication. Stepping back out into the pouring rain, he slammed the heavy metal door shut with a deafening crash. I heard the harsh scrape of the exterior deadbolt sliding firmly into place. He blindly trusted the physical boundaries of a room he did not understand. I sat on the freezing concrete floor in the pitch black. The sound of Damon's footsteps rapidly faded into the relentless drumming of the winter storm. I stopped shaking and slowly pushed myself up. Navigating through the absolute darkness with flawless spatial memory, I located the broken plastic lawn chair in the corner and sat down. I reached beneath the frame and retrieved my encrypted military-grade laptop from its hidden compartment inside the torn garbage bag. I opened the heavy metal lid. The sharp blue light of the screen illuminated my face, casting long shadows across the decaying walls. Damon had severed the main electrical line, assuming he had cut off my access to the outside world. He completely forgot about cellular data networks. I engaged the encrypted cellular modem built directly into the motherboard of my machine. Bypassing the estate's local network entirely, I established a secure, untraceable connection to a private offshore server. I opened the digital dossier I had compiled over the past 48 hours. I specifically targeted the audio files I had intercepted from the main house network. I located the exact recording I had captured earlier that morning. It was the heavily encrypted phone call between Brent and the international travel agent seamlessly intercepted while he was booking his one-way flight to Paris with Heather. I opened the audio editor and isolated a specific, highly damaging 10-second soundbite. In the clear recording, Brent laughed mockingly into the receiver. He explicitly referred to his wife Ebony as a gullible stepping stone. He detailed exactly how easy it had been to manipulate her into fighting her own brother for control of the estate. He bragged about his imminent plan to steal the offshore escrow funds and abandon her entirely the moment the wire transfer cleared. It was a brutal, undeniable confession of absolute treason. I opened a secure, anonymized messaging application. I routed the origin signal through 3 different international proxy servers to ensure the sender could never be traced back to the pool house. I entered Ebony's private, unlisted cellular number. She closely guarded this number, reserving it strictly for high-level business contacts and emergencies. I attached the isolated audio file to a blank message. I did not include any text. A warning or an explanation would only dilute the psychological impact of the recording. The raw audio of her husband's betrayal was infinitely more devastating than any words I could write. I stared at the blinking cursor for a fraction of a second. I pressed the transmission key. The progress bar flashed green, confirming the encrypted data packet had successfully breached the digital atmosphere. The civil war had officially begun. I fired the opening shot. The freezing night tested my physical endurance. The concrete floor leached the warmth from my bones, but the burning anticipation of the impending fallout sustained me. I remained awake, monitoring the encrypted network traffic scrolling across my laptop screen. Ebony opened the audio file at precisely 3 a.m. For several hours there was absolute digital silence. She was processing the profound humiliation of her husband's betrayal. She was absorbing the toxic reality that she was merely a disposable asset. The recording was the precise spark required to detonate their fragile ecosystem. Once Ebony realized Brent was fleeing, she inevitably began searching for his co-conspirator. The sun crested the horizon, casting pale light through the filthy skylight. The storm had passed, leaving behind a heavy fog that clung to the manicured lawns. I stood up, my joints aching from the profound cold, and walked to the cracked window facing the glass facade of the main house. The grand dining room was fully visible. At exactly 7 o'clock, the anticipated explosion occurred. The heavy French doors flew open with violent force. Brent stumbled backward into the frame, his hands raised defensively. He was still wearing his silk pajamas. Ebony advanced on him with the terrifying, unhinged fury of a woman whose entire reality shattered. She hurled a massive porcelain vase directly at Brent's head. Brent ducked wildly. The vase smashed against the marble wall, exploding into thousands of razor-sharp fragments. The deafening crash echoed across the quiet estate. Brent scrambled backward, slipping on the polished floor and falling hard into the wreckage. He scrambled to his feet, bleeding from a superficial cut on his cheek, his face pale with absolute terror. He raised his hands in a desperate gesture of appeasement. Ebony screamed with a visceral, throat-tearing intensity. She pointed a trembling finger at his face, unleashing a torrent of accusations regarding the Paris airline tickets. She had torn through his belongings while he slept, finding the printed itineraries. The illusion of their unified marriage evaporated entirely, replaced by the raw truth of mutual exploitation. The commotion drew Damon and Heather out of the master suite. Damon rushed into the dining room, his face flushed with panic. He desperately attempted to intervene, stepping between his sister and her husband. He raised his hands, pleading for calm, oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath his feet had already collapsed. Damon ordered Ebony to lower her voice, citing the fragile nature of the pending escrow deal. He demanded absolute unity until the developer signed the final transfer documents. Ebony turned her blinding rage directly onto her brother. She did not comply with his frantic demands for peace. Instead, she reached into her robe pocket and pulled out a stack of printed emails. When she had discovered Brent's flight itinerary, she had aggressively hacked into the estate's shared network to find the full extent of the conspiracy. Ebony shoved the printed emails against Damon's chest. She screamed the contents of the messages. She revealed Heather's explicit instructions to funnel the entire developer payout into a secondary shell account, exclusively under Damon's name. She exposed the calculated plot to completely cut Ebony out of the final property sale. Damon stood frozen amidst the shattered porcelain. He stared down at the printed emails in his hands, his eyes darting frantically across the text. The color completely drained from his face. He slowly turned to look at his wife. Heather did not offer a tearful apology. She did not attempt to deny the irrefutable evidence of her treason. The facade of the supportive spouse instantly vanished. She recognized that the deception was completely exposed. She immediately shifted to the offensive. Heather crossed her arms over her chest, her expression hardening into a mask of pure predatory malice. She looked at Damon not with the affection of a partner, but with the cold calculation of an auditor liquidating a bankrupt asset. Heather turned on her heel and marched directly out of the dining room. Damon stumbled after her, begging for an explanation. I watched through the grime-covered window as they moved into the grand foyer. Heather reappeared dragging a luxury leather travel bag. She had already packed her belongings. She was executing her contingency protocol. She stood by the massive front doors and delivered a brutal, uncompromising ultimatum. She told Damon that his sheer incompetence had endangered her entire financial future. She commanded him to force the emergency wire transfer before the end of the business day. If the escrow funds did not hit their designated offshore accounts by 5 o'clock, she promised to completely destroy him. She threatened to drag him into a highly publicized divorce court utilizing his hidden gambling debts to strip him of his remaining dignity and guarantee federal prison time. Heather did not wait for his response. She walked out of the front doors, dragging her heavy bag down the stone steps. She climbed into her luxury sport utility vehicle, started the engine, and sped down the long driveway, vanishing into the thick morning fog. She was abandoning the battlefield, positioning herself at a safe distance while her husband absorbed the ultimate risk. Damon was left standing entirely alone in the foyer. The walls of the fortress he had attempted to steal were rapidly closing in on him. He was trapped between his sister's absolute fury, his wife's devastating legal threats, and the violent international creditors demanding immediate payment. He had no strategic options remaining. Damon sprinted back through the house. He emerged from the side garage moments later, practically throwing himself into his sleek, imported sports car. The engine roared to life with a desperate, aggressive surge of power. The tires spun wildly on the wet pavement, kicking up a massive spray of gravel and mud. He accelerated recklessly down the winding path, tearing out of the front gates in a frantic bid to intercept the commercial developer and force the premature release of the escrow funds. He was operating on pure blind panic. He believed he could still salvage the collapsing financial architecture of his life. I stood in the freezing shadows of the pool house and watched his vehicle disappear into the dense gray mist. The estate was now dead quiet, save for the distant sound of Ebony sobbing in the ruined dining room. The chaos had played out with mathematical precision. The violent fracturing of their alliances had removed the final variables from the equation. The trap was now fully primed. I walked back to the broken plastic chair and picked up my encrypted laptop. I retrieved my cellular device from my pocket. I looked at the time display. It was exactly 8 in the morning. The financial institutions were officially open for business. I dialed Aaron's direct secure line. He answered on the very first ring, his voice sharp and alert. I did not offer any greetings. I looked at the shattered remnants of my children's lives. I issued a simple, unequivocal command. I told Aaron to drop the legal anvil. I maintained the secure connection with Aaron for exactly 45 seconds. I did not require a lengthy conversation to initiate the final phase of my strategy. I simply provided my attorney with the precise digital routing numbers Damon intended to use for his emergency wire transfer. I instructed Aaron to execute the quiet legal injunction we had drafted the previous morning. Aaron confirmed the order immediately. He contacted the federal magistrate and submitted the undeniable photographic evidence of the forged quitclaim deed alongside the fraudulent offshore bridge loan. The federal court system moved with unprecedented velocity when presented with absolute, irrefutable proof of international wire fraud. Within minutes, a mandatory federal freeze was permanently attached to every single financial account associated with Damon Ebony and the offshore lending entity. The trap was no longer theoretical. It was a legally binding reality. I terminated the call with my attorney and immediately pivoted my attention back to the encrypted laptop resting on my knees. Damon had sped away from the estate in a state of absolute blind panic. He believed he could outrun his collapsing marriage and his violent creditors by forcing the bank to release the $2 million from the offshore bridge loan. He failed to comprehend that I was already miles ahead of his pathetic strategy. I engaged the remote access protocol I had successfully embedded into Damon's cellular device during my initial network infiltration. The digital microphone on his smartphone activated silently, bypassing his security settings without triggering a single notification. I routed the live audio feed directly through the high-fidelity speakers of my machine. I sat in the freezing, mold-scented darkness of the pool house, listening to the frantic, heavy breathing of my son. The audio feed painted a vivid, chaotic picture of Damon's psychological deterioration. I heard the aggressive roar of his sports car engine as he recklessly accelerated through the downtown financial district. I heard him cursing violently, his voice cracking with the immense pressure of Heather's devastating ultimatum. If he did not secure that money by 5 o'clock, his wife would absolutely destroy him in divorce court and expose his catastrophic gambling debts. He was a desperate man sprinting directly toward a reinforced brick wall. The screech of burning rubber echoed through my speakers as Damon illegally parked his vehicle. I heard the heavy thud of the car door slamming shut, followed by the rapid, frantic slapping of his expensive leather shoes against the wet pavement. Damon burst through the heavy glass doors of the primary downtown banking branch. The ambient acoustics of the grand lobby flooded my audio feed, capturing the hushed murmur of wealthy clients and the soft instrumental music playing through the overhead system. Damon did not respect the quiet atmosphere of the institution. He marched directly past the standard teller line and demanded immediate service. His voice was loud, arrogant, and completely saturated with manufactured authority. He loudly proclaimed his status as a premium wealth management client. He demanded to speak with a senior wire transfer specialist to authorize an emergency international routing protocol. I listened closely as a female bank representative attempted to calm his erratic behavior. She guided him toward a private teller window, her tone polite but distinctly strained. Damon slammed his identification and his premium account card onto the marble counter. He barked the offshore routing numbers at the teller, demanding she bypass the standard waiting periods and instantly clear the $2 million bridge loan into his personal domestic account. He aggressively cited his pristine financial history, completely oblivious to the fact that his history was an illusion funded entirely by my silent generosity. The teller did not argue. I heard the rapid, rhythmic clacking of her keyboard as she entered his credentials into the central banking mainframe. Then the typing stopped completely. A long, agonizing silence stretched across the audio feed. Damon tapped his fingers impatiently against the marble counter, issuing a sharp demand for maximum efficiency. The teller finally spoke. Her voice had dropped an entire octave. All traces of practiced corporate politeness had vanished. She informed Damon that she was unable to process his request. She stated that a severe administrative hold had been placed on his portfolio. Damon exploded. He pounded his fist against the counter, demanding she override the system error immediately. He screamed that he was losing millions of dollars by the second. The teller did not flinch. She requested that he wait for the branch manager to resolve the discrepancy. She was following strict federal protocols for interacting with a flagged criminal suspect. I heard the sharp click of her terminal locking. She was discreetly triggering the silent security alarm beneath her desk. Aaron's federal injunction had permanently marked Damon's profile with a severe international fraud warning. The system recognized my son not as a wealthy client, but as an active financial terrorist. Heavy, deliberate footsteps approached the teller window. The branch manager introduced himself in a low, uncompromising tone. Damon instantly attempted to assert dominance, threatening to pull his entire portfolio from the institution if the funds were not released. The manager cut him off mid-sentence. The manager coldly informed Damon that his account was not experiencing a technical glitch. He stated that the federal government had officially seized the offshore bridge loan under a direct mandate from a federal judge. He explicitly told Damon that the account was flagged for massive international wire fraud and criminal forgery. Damon stopped breathing. The pure, unfiltered terror radiating from his silence was palpable through the digital feed. The arrogant facade shattered completely. He finally realized the bridge loan was gone. The $2 million he desperately needed to save his life did not exist. The manager calmly requested that Damon accompany him to a secure holding office to answer questions regarding the fraudulent offshore lien. Simultaneously, the heavy, distinct sound of tactical boots echoed across the lobby floor. 2 armed municipal police officers were quickly closing the distance between the main entrance and the teller window. The instinct for absolute survival violently seized control of my son's paralyzed brain. He realized he was seconds away from wearing federal handcuffs. Damon let out a feral, desperate gasp. I heard the violent scrape of heavy wood against marble. Damon grabbed a solid oak chair positioned near the counter and shoved it backward with all his remaining physical strength, sending it crashing directly into the path of the approaching police officers. The deafening clatter of the collision echoed through the bank. Damon did not look back. He sprinted in the opposite direction. I listened to his frantic, ragged breathing as he shoved his way through the panicked crowd. He hit the emergency push bar of the side fire exit, triggering a loud, blaring alarm that pierced my audio feed. He burst out into the cold alleyway, his shoes slipping wildly on the wet asphalt. He ran with the sheer, unadulterated panic of a hunted animal. He scrambled through the concrete parking garage, his breath catching in his throat with every agonizing step. He reached his sports car, desperately clawing at the door handle. He threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, sealing himself in the quiet isolation of the vehicle. Damon sat in the driver's seat, gasping for air, attempting to process the total destruction of his reality. Then a sharp, piercing chime echoed through the car. It was his cellular notification tone. My decryption software instantly intercepted the incoming data packet, displaying the text message directly on my laptop screen in real time. The message was from Marcus Sterling, the luxury commercial developer. The text was brief, brutal, and utterly final. Sterling formally announced that his legal team had received a highly confidential courier package 20 minutes prior. The package contained a flawless high-resolution photograph of the forged quitclaim deed and the fraudulent offshore loan documents. Sterling stated that he was terminating the multi-million-dollar acquisition of the estate permanently. He explicitly threatened to involve the district attorney if Damon ever attempted to contact his firm again. I sat in the freezing darkness of the pool house and stared at the final confirmation of my victory. I had orchestrated the delivery of that courier package the moment I spoke to Aaron. The legal anvil had crushed them completely. Damon read the text message. He dropped his phone onto the passenger seat. He had no bridge loan. He had no developer payout. He had absolutely zero cash. He was a fugitive from the federal government with violent creditors waiting for him. Damon buried his face in his hands and unleashed a raw, agonizing scream that echoed through my speakers. The kingdom he attempted to steal had collapsed directly on his head. I remained seated in the freezing darkness of the pool house, my eyes locked onto the glowing screen of my encrypted laptop. I had previously tapped directly into the estate's high-definition security network, granting me unrestricted visual and audio access to every room in the main house. Damon's sports car tore up the gravel driveway a fraction of an hour later. He did not park in the garage. He abandoned the vehicle directly on the front lawn, leaving the driver's side door wide open to the elements. He sprinted up the marble steps and burst through the mahogany front doors. I switched the camera feed to the formal living room. The chaotic aftermath of the morning's confrontation had metastasized into a full-scale domestic war. Ebony, Brent, and Heather were already gathered near the central fireplace. Heather had not made it to the airport. The federal asset freeze had instantly paralyzed her personal credit cards and her private checking accounts the moment she attempted to purchase a premium boarding pass. She was trapped. Damon stumbled into the living room. His expensive suit was soaked with freezing rain and sweat. His chest heaved violently as he braced himself against the doorframe. The room instantly erupted. 4 desperate cornered predators began screaming simultaneously. Heather lunged forward, her face twisted in absolute fury. She demanded to know why her premium credit accounts were declining at the airline terminal. She screamed that she was supposed to be halfway across the Atlantic Ocean. Brent stood near the velvet sofa, clutching his cellular phone like a lifeline. He shouted that his offshore shell company was completely locked out of the international banking portal. He accused Damon of deliberately sabotaging the bridge loan transfer to hoard the stolen cash for himself. Ebony turned her wrath onto her husband, throwing a heavy silver candlestick that narrowly missed Brent's shoulder. She shrieked that Brent had no right to demand anything after attempting to abandon her to federal authorities. The alliances they had meticulously forged to steal my legacy were completely shattered. It was a spectacular display of mutual assured destruction. Damon raised his hands, screaming for everyone to shut their mouths. His voice cracked with sheer, unadulterated panic. He silenced the room by dropping the final catastrophic bombshell. He announced that Marcus Sterling had officially terminated the estate acquisition. Damon confessed that the commercial developer had received a verified physical copy of the forged quitclaim deed and the fraudulent offshore loan paperwork. He looked directly at Heather and Brent, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He informed them that the bank manager had confirmed a federal judge had seized the offshore bridge loan. The millions of dollars they had illegally secured against my property were gone. They had absolutely zero cash. They possessed no leverage. They were entirely bankrupt and actively bleeding evidence. Heather staggered backward, dropping her designer handbag onto the Persian rug, the color completely drained from her flawless face. She realized the magnitude of her legal exposure. She immediately attempted to isolate herself from the collateral damage. She pointed a trembling finger at Damon, declaring that she had never signed a single financial document. She threatened to call the district attorney right now and testify that Damon had orchestrated the entire forgery scheme without her knowledge. Ebony retaliated instantly, stepping directly into Heather's personal space. She reminded her sister-in-law of the explicit emails sitting on the estate server. She promised to drag Heather into a federal penitentiary cell right alongside them. Brent paced the floor, muttering frantic calculations regarding international extradition treaties. The White in-laws were finally experiencing the suffocating, inescapable gravity of the trap they had eagerly helped build. The vicious shouting match was abruptly silenced by a heavy, authoritative sound. A series of sharp, rhythmic knocks echoed from the grand foyer. The massive mahogany front doors vibrated under the force of the pounding. The four of them froze instantly. The heavy oak grandfather clock ticking in the corner was the only sound in the room. They stared at the entryway with the primal fear of hunted prey, realizing the hounds had arrived. Damon swallowed hard. He slowly backed away from his wife, his shoes dragging heavily against the hardwood floor. He crossed the foyer with hesitant, trembling steps. He reached out and grabbed the brass handle, pulling the heavy door inward. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood on the front porch. He was flanked by two fully uniformed county sheriff's deputies. The deputies rested their hands casually near their duty belts, projecting a silent, overwhelming authority. The man in the center did not wear a uniform, but he radiated a cold, bureaucratic efficiency. He was a senior county process server. He looked down at a clipboard, verifying the address against the brass numbers mounted on the stone pillar. He looked up at my son. He asked Damon to confirm his legal identity. Damon nodded slowly, his voice completely failing him. The process server did not offer a polite greeting. He simply reached into his thick leather satchel and extracted a massive bound stack of legal documents. He shoved the heavy paperwork directly into Damon's chest, forcing my son to grasp the files or let them fall to the wet marble. The process server announced that Damon and all current occupants of the estate were being formally served. He explicitly detailed the contents of the thick packet in a loud, clear voice that carried perfectly into the living room. He stated that the documents contained a mandatory immediate notice of eviction. Furthermore, he announced that the packet included a direct federal summons mandating Damon's appearance in court to answer preliminary charges of severe international wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The process server informed Damon that he and his family had exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises entirely before the sheriff's department returned to forcibly remove them and secure the property perimeter. The process server nodded sharply to the deputies. The three men turned and walked down the steps, their boots crunching loudly on the gravel driveway. Damon pushed the front door shut with a weak, trembling hand. He leaned back against the solid mahogany wood, staring blankly at the massive stack of legal papers in his grasp. Ebony, Heather, and Brent crept out of the living room, gathering in the grand foyer like frightened children. Ebony demanded to know who had authorized an eviction. She shrieked that they were the legal owners of the property, citing the forged quitclaim deed they had submitted to the county clerk. She insisted the eviction was a clerical mistake that their attorneys could easily dismiss. Damon did not respond to her frantic reassurances. He slowly flipped over the first page of the legal packet. He stared at the bold black ink printed across the top of the federal complaint. I watched his eyes widen in pure, unfiltered horror through the high-definition security feed. He read the designated plaintiff listed on the formal eviction notice. His lips moved silently, forming the words that completely annihilated his entire perception of reality. He finally spoke the name aloud, his voice barely a hollow whisper. The plaintiff executing the eviction and initiating the federal fraud charges was the Coretta and Jameson Irrevocable Trust. The collective realization hit the foyer with the devastating force of a physical shockwave. Ebony covered her mouth with both hands, stifling a ragged scream. Brent stumbled backward, bracing himself against the marble console table. Heather closed her eyes in absolute defeat. The forged quitclaim deed they had staked their entire lives upon was completely worthless. They had attempted to steal an estate from a man who did not legally own it, 5 years ago, immediately following Coretta's initial terminal diagnosis, we recognized the potential vulnerability of our massive portfolio. I quietly engaged Aaron to construct a highly fortified, blind corporate trust. I transferred the master deed of the estate along with all primary liquid assets entirely into the absolute protection of the Coretta and Jameson Irrevocable Trust. I legally removed my name from the direct ownership records to ensure our life's work could never be targeted by predatory lawsuits or external manipulation. I became a mere trustee of the property. My children had forged my signature to seize a house I had already given away half a decade prior. They had proudly handed the commercial developer a fabricated title that legally belonged to a multi-million-dollar corporate entity. They never owned a single brick of my legacy. I sat comfortably in the plush, high-backed leather chair of my downtown corporate boardroom. The expansive floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a commanding view of the city skyline, a stark contrast to the freezing, mold-infested walls of the pool house I had occupied for the past several weeks. A massive mahogany conference table stretched out before me, completely clear, except for my encrypted military-grade laptop and a steaming cup of black coffee. I had tapped directly into the estate's high-definition security network prior to my departure. The multi-monitor array on my desk broadcasted pristine, real-time footage of every room in the main house. I watched the catastrophic fallout of the eviction notice unfold with absolute calculating precision. The shock in the grand foyer rapidly mutated into a feral, desperate rage. The four predators realized they were trapped in a cage of their own design. Heather was the first to recover her predatory instincts. She slapped the heavy federal summons out of Damon's trembling hands, sending the thick stack of legal papers scattering across the polished marble floor. She possessed a ruthless, analytical mind, and the pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking into place. She screamed at the group that they had been comprehensively played. She deduced that the intricate web of digital evidence, the offshore account tracking, and the intercepted audio files could not have generated themselves spontaneously. She recognized that the trembling, demented old man was a meticulously crafted phantom. She told her husband, her sister-in-law, and Brent that I had to possess a central communications hub. She reasoned that I was hiding a physical device, a laptop, or a secure server storing the raw data required to build the federal case against them. Heather ordered them to march directly to the pool house. She commanded them to physically drag me out of the shadows, seize whatever computer equipment I was utilizing, and smash it into unrecognizable pieces. She believed that destroying the physical hardware would somehow erase the digital footprint of their massive international wire fraud. It was the frantic, illogical desperation of a woman staring directly at a lengthy federal prison sentence. Damon and Brent instantly seized upon the violent directive. It gave them a physical target for their overwhelming panic. The four of them moved toward the side service exit as a unified pack of cornered animals. Damon retrieved a heavy steel crowbar from the utility closet near the garage. Brent armed himself with a solid brass fireplace poker from the living room hearth. They abandoned the warmth of the main house and marched aggressively across the wet, manicured lawn. The morning fog was still exceptionally thick, swirling around their expensive designer clothes as they closed the distance to the isolated structure. I zoomed in on the exterior camera feed, capturing the rigid tension in their shoulders. Their faces were twisted with a toxic mixture of absolute terror and homicidal fury. They were fully prepared to commit severe physical violence against an elderly man to save themselves from total bankruptcy. They genuinely believed they could simply intimidate me into reversing a legally binding, irrevocable trust. Damon reached the heavy, reinforced door of the pool house. He did not bother to unlock the deadbolt he had so proudly engaged the previous night. He raised the solid steel crowbar high above his head and swung it violently against the wooden frame. The heavy metal bit deep into the door jamb. Damon grunted with exertion, leveraging his entire body weight against the tool. The aged wood splintered and cracked loudly under the immense pressure. Brent stepped forward and kicked the door directly near the lock mechanism. The strike plate tore free from the frame with a violent crunch. The heavy door swung inward, hitting the concrete wall with a deafening slam. The four of them rushed into the dark, damp space weapons raised, ready to unleash their collective panic upon my fragile frame. They charged into the center of the room, screaming my name into the darkness. They demanded I surrender the laptop and the offshore account passwords immediately. They promised leniency if I cooperated, layering their threats with pathetic, transparent lies. They were met with absolute, suffocating silence. Ebony fumbled frantically for the wall switch, completely forgetting that Damon had severed the main power line the night before. Brent pulled out his cellular device and engaged the bright LED flashlight feature. He swept the piercing white beam across the freezing concrete floor, the rotting wooden walls, and the dark corners of the structure. The beam illuminated a devastating reality. The room was entirely deserted. I was not cowering in the corner. I was not shivering on the damp floorboards. I was gone. The realization that their primary target had vanished pushed them over the edge of rational thought. Damon let out a feral, guttural scream of raw frustration. He raised the steel crowbar and brought it crashing down onto the broken plastic lawn chair, shattering it into dozens of jagged white fragments. He swung again, smashing the brittle plastic until nothing remained but dust and splinters. Brent attacked the small cot in the corner. He utilized the brass fireplace poker to violently slash the thin fabric of the mattress. He tore the cheap foam apart in a frantic, frenzied search for hidden flash drives or encrypted hard drives. He ripped the bedding to shreds, throwing the ruined material across the damp concrete. Ebony and Heather dropped to their knees in the dirt. They kicked over the empty cardboard boxes, overturning the garbage bags and tearing the false bottoms completely apart. They decimated the tiny, miserable space, desperate to find a single shred of leverage. They searched for a hidden compartment, a buried cellular phone, or any physical clue indicating where I had fled. They clawed at the floorboards, their manicured fingernails scraping against the cold stone. They found absolutely nothing. I had meticulously sanitized the environment hours before their arrival. I had removed every trace of my digital presence, leaving them with nothing but the freezing damp and the overwhelming stench of their own monumental failure. They stood amidst the ruined debris of the pool house, their chests heaving with exhaustion. Their weapons lowered slowly to their sides in sheer crushing defeat. The absolute certainty of federal prison and public humiliation settled heavily onto their shoulders. The grand illusion of their wealth was entirely obliterated. Then a sharp, crisp electronic tone cut through the dead silence of the room. It was Damon's cellular phone ringing in his trousers. Damon dropped the steel crowbar onto the concrete. The heavy metal clanged sharply, causing Ebony to flinch. He retrieved the device with violently shaking fingers. He stared down at the bright caller identification screen. He saw my name flashing in bold, undeniable letters. He swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. He looked up at his wife, his sister, and his brother-in-law. They stared back at him with wide, terrified eyes, paralyzed by the ringing device. Damon pressed the accept button and slowly raised the speaker to his ear. I leaned forward in my plush leather boardroom chair. I looked at the expansive view of the downtown skyline through the pristine glass. I did not speak with the weak, trembling stutter of a broken man mourning his late wife. I did not project the submissive whisper of a father terrified of his own children. I spoke with the precise, uncompromising authority of the patriarch who had built an international logistics empire from the ground up. I ordered Damon to place the cellular device on speaker mode immediately. He complied instantly, his hands vibrating as he held the phone out toward the center of the ruined room. I addressed the four of them directly. I informed them that their infantile, destructive rampage through the pool house was currently being recorded by a concealed micro camera and automatically added to their expanding federal evidence file. I told them that their forged quitclaim deed, their offshore bridge loan, and their pathetic escape flights to Paris were completely dismantled. I commanded them to drive immediately to my downtown corporate headquarters if they wished to negotiate the exact terms of their survival. I terminated the connection, leaving them standing in the freezing darkness to contemplate the absolute magnitude of their ruin. The four of them piled into Damon's remaining sports vehicle, leaving the shattered remnants of the pool house behind. The drive into the downtown financial district was suffocatingly silent. The crushing weight of the federal summons rested heavily on Damon's lap, a physical manifestation of their impending doom. They arrived at the towering steel and glass skyscraper that housed the global headquarters of my international logistics firm. This was the impenetrable fortress I had built from absolutely nothing. Damon and Ebony had grown up walking these polished halls, acting like entitled heirs to an empire they never bothered to understand. Now they entered the massive atrium, not as royalty, but as cornered, desperate fugitives. Their expensive designer clothes were stained with mud from the winter storm and torn from their frantic, infantile rampage through my temporary shelter. The pristine, clinical corporate environment instantly magnified their pathetic, disheveled state. A heavily armed team of private security contractors waited in the expansive marble lobby. They did not offer a warm greeting or a polite nod of recognition. They moved with terrifying military precision, seamlessly surrounding my children and their spouses without uttering a single word. Damon attempted to issue a sharp command to the head of security, a man who had known him since his teenage years. The guards simply stared straight through him, recognizing only one true authority inside this building. The security team escorted the silent, trembling group into the private executive elevator. The heavy titanium doors slid shut, sealing them inside the reinforced steel box. The elevator rapidly ascended 50 floors, carrying them smoothly toward their absolute and final reckoning. The elevator chimes rang out with a crisp, clear tone. The doors parted to reveal the executive penthouse suite. The guards marched them down the quiet, carpeted corridor and pushed open the heavy double doors of the main boardroom. The space was an intimidating marvel of raw corporate power. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a panoramic, dizzying view of the sprawling city skyline below. A massive, polished mahogany table dominated the exact center of the room. I sat perfectly straight at the head of the table. The cheap, damp polyester uniform Damon had forced me to wear the previous night was gone. I was dressed in my immaculate, custom-tailored charcoal suit. My silver tie was perfectly knotted at my collar. My hands rested flat and exceptionally steady on the polished wood. The violent, pathetic tremor I had weaponized for weeks was entirely absent. I was not sitting alone. Aaron, my fiercely loyal corporate attorney, sat to my immediate right. His posture was rigid. His leather legal briefcase was open, exposing thick stacks of authenticated financial documents and federal warrants. To my left sat a man radiating cold, uncompromising authority. He wore a dark federal windbreaker over a pressed shirt. A solid gold badge rested on the mahogany table directly in front of him. He was a senior investigator for the Federal Financial Crimes Division. He looked at Damon and Ebony with the predatory, unblinking gaze of a hound that had just cornered its prey. The four antagonists stood frozen in the doorway, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the trap they had blindly walked into. The silence in the boardroom was absolute and suffocating. Damon's eyes darted frantically between my steady, calculating gaze, Aaron's intimidating legal files, and the gleaming federal badge. His mind violently rejected the catastrophic reality unfolding before him. He stubbornly refused to accept that the frail, demented father he had physically dragged through the mud was a carefully constructed, flawlessly executed illusion. Damon lunged forward aggressively, closing the distance to the table. He slammed his bruised hands violently onto the pristine mahogany surface. The heavy wood absorbed the physical impact without a sound. He screamed at me, his voice cracking with sheer, unhinged desperation. He demanded to know what kind of sick, elaborate psychological trick I was playing. He ordered me to drop the act immediately and fix the massive disaster regarding the offshore bridge loan. He genuinely still believed he possessed the authority to issue demands. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch at his physical aggression. I looked at the man I had raised and felt absolutely nothing but clinical, chilling detachment. Ebony stood directly behind her brother, her arms wrapped tightly around her stomach, her eyes wide with dawning, paralyzing horror. Brent and Heather hovered near the heavy doors, instinctively seeking an exit that had already been sealed. I slowly picked up a sleek black projector remote resting near my coffee cup. I slid the device smoothly across the polished mahogany table. It stopped precisely in the center, equidistant from everyone in the room. I reached out and clicked a single silent button on my master console. The massive digital wall screen situated directly behind me instantly illuminated. The brilliant white light flooded the boardroom, casting stark, unforgiving shadows across the faces of my children. The screen displayed a meticulously organized, high-definition mosaic of their complete destruction. On the left side of the display, the forged quitclaim deed was heavily magnified. Red digital circles highlighted the microscopic discrepancies in the fabricated signature. Aaron had already verified the blatant forgery with 3 independent handwriting experts. Beside the deed, the screen displayed the highly classified routing numbers for the offshore bridge loan they had illegally secured against my trust. I clicked the master remote a second time. The massive display shifted seamlessly. The screen now showcased high-resolution surveillance photographs of Heather and Brent meeting secretly with the offshore lenders. Beside those damning images, a detailed international flight itinerary appeared. It clearly showed 2 premium first-class tickets to Paris booked under Heather's private credit card, scheduled to depart the exact day the escrow funds were supposed to clear. Damon turned slowly, staring at his wife with a look of profound, sickening betrayal. Heather looked away entirely, unable to meet his broken gaze. Ebony stared at Brent, her jaw trembling violently as the reality of his planned desertion physically crushed her spirit. I was not finished. I clicked the remote a third time. A digital audio waveform appeared across the bottom of the glowing screen. I pressed play. The pristine acoustic speakers embedded in the boardroom ceiling broadcasted the intercepted conversations with crystal clarity. The entire room listened to Damon explicitly detailing his malicious plan to replace my blood pressure medication and artificially accelerate my cognitive decline. The audio transitioned flawlessly to Ebony laughing maliciously as she mocked my profound grief over Coretta's death. The final clip played without interruption. It was Brent's voice echoing through the silent boardroom, explicitly referring to Ebony as a gullible stepping stone while finalizing his luxurious escape to Europe. The audio files concluded, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their devastating wake. The four of them stood completely shattered. Their lies, their treason, and their vicious mutual betrayals were fully exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the federal investigator. They had absolutely nowhere left to hide. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table and leaned forward. I locked eyes with Damon, ensuring he felt the full, crushing weight of my absolute authority. I kept my voice dangerously low, yet it carried perfectly across the vast, quiet room. I reminded Damon and Ebony of our previous fateful engagement. I recalled how they had invited me to a cheap, greasy diner just weeks ago, presenting a fraudulent medical evaluation to legally declare me incompetent and steal my autonomy. I paused, letting the memory of their supreme arrogance hang in the freezing air. I told them I had brought them to this pristine boardroom today for a distinctly different purpose. I was not here to evaluate their mental competence. I brought them here to officially declare them bankrupt. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The word bankrupt hung in the refrigerated air of the executive penthouse, striking my children with the force of a physical blow. The federal investigator sitting to my left leaned forward. He unclasped his hands and placed a thick manila folder directly on the mahogany table. The gesture was simple but conveyed an overwhelming, suffocating threat. He informed the four of them that the United States government possessed enough verified documentation to secure federal indictments for conspiracy, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. He advised them that cooperation was their only remaining currency. Heather reacted with the terrifying, instantaneous survival instinct of a cornered predator. The calculated mask of the devoted wife evaporated, replaced by a frantic, ruthless desperation to avoid a concrete cell. She took a deliberate step away from Damon, physically distancing herself from the sinking ship of his impending incarceration. She looked directly at the federal investigator and began to weep. It was a flawless, theatrical performance. Genuine tears welled in her eyes as she claimed she was entirely innocent. She declared she was a victim of severe emotional abuse, trapped in a marriage to a manipulative narcissist. She pointed a manicured finger directly at Damon's chest. She swore she had never seen the forged quitclaim deed and insisted Damon had forced her to sign the offshore loan documents under severe duress and threats of physical violence. Brent witnessed Heather's masterful pivot and immediately deployed the exact same strategy. He turned his back on Ebony. He addressed the investigator, his voice trembling with fabricated remorse. He claimed Ebony was the sole mastermind behind the entire operation. He stated she had harbored a vicious, decades-long resentment against her father and had orchestrated the fake dementia evaluation entirely on her own. Brent insisted he was merely a bystander, kept entirely in the dark about the international wire fraud until the money mysteriously appeared in their joint accounts. They were actively sacrificing their spouses to the federal justice system to save their own skin. Damon and Ebony stood paralyzed. They stared at their spouses with wide, uncomprehending eyes. The people they had trusted implicitly, the partners they had colluded with to steal my legacy, were casually offering them up for federal slaughter. Damon opened his mouth to defend himself, his jaw working uselessly, but no sound emerged. Ebony simply shook her head, unable to process the sheer magnitude of Brent's treacherous lies. I did not allow the pathetic masquerade to continue. I picked up the black projector remote resting on the polished mahogany. I clicked a single button. The massive digital wall screen flickered. The visual display of the forged documents vanished, replaced by a stark, rolling audio transcript. The high-fidelity speakers embedded in the boardroom ceiling cracked to life. The audio was pristine, uncompressed, and impossibly loud. It was a direct recording from the interior cabin of Brent's luxury sedan, captured just 48 hours prior via the micro-tracker I had slipped into his winter coat. Brent's voice echoed through the boardroom. He was not speaking as a frightened, manipulated victim. He was laughing with profound, arrogant malice. He explicitly outlined the exact sequence of the wire fraud to Heather. He detailed how easily he had convinced Ebony to sign away her legal protections. He called my daughter a pathetic, gullible stepping stone, useful only for her authorized signature. The recording seamlessly transitioned to Heather's voice. She did not sound abused or terrified. She sounded cold, commanding, and infinitely greedy. She instructed Brent to ensure the Paris flight tickets were booked under an untraceable corporate alias. She explicitly detailed her plan to drain the offshore bridge loan the second the developer cleared the funds, leaving Damon with nothing but the massive federal tax liability and the forged deed. She mocked Damon's intelligence, stating he was so blinded by his own arrogance he would not realize they were gone until the plane was already over the Atlantic. The audio file terminated. The crushing reality of the recording settled over the room. The illusion of victimhood Heather and Brent had desperately attempted to construct was completely obliterated by their own recorded words. The federal investigator wrote a single note on his legal pad, his expression entirely devoid of sympathy. Ebony snapped. The profound, suffocating humiliation of hearing her husband refer to her as a disposable object broke whatever fragile restraint she possessed. She let out a visceral, agonizing scream of pure rage. She lunged across the polished floor and struck Brent directly across the face with a violent, open-handed slap. The sharp crack of skin against skin echoed loudly in the quiet boardroom. Brent stumbled backward, clutching his rapidly reddening cheek, his eyes wide with shock. Ebony did not stop. She grabbed the lapels of his expensive suit, shaking him violently, screaming that she had destroyed her relationship with her father for a man who viewed her as absolute garbage. Damon reacted with equal, unhinged ferocity. The realization that his wife had orchestrated his absolute ruin behind a mask of supportive affection shattered his sanity. He let out a feral roar and lunged across the heavy mahogany table toward Heather. He did not care about the federal investigator or the armed security waiting outside the doors. He simply wanted to inflict the same agonizing pain he was currently experiencing. He grabbed Heather's shoulder, twisting her violently toward him. The boardroom erupted into total, uncontrolled chaos. The federal investigator instantly stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. He shouted for order, his voice booming with absolute commanding authority. Aaron remained perfectly still beside me, his hands resting calmly on his legal briefcase. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. The tactical security team flooded into the room. They moved with brutal efficiency, physically separating the warring couples. 2 guards restrained Damon, pinning his arms behind his back while he thrashed and screamed profanities at his wife. Another guard pulled Ebony away from Brent, forcing her into a leather chair where she collapsed into violent, uncontrollable sobbing. Heather backed against the floor-to-ceiling glass window, her chest heaving, her flawless hair disheveled. She glared at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. She realized I had orchestrated every single element of this confrontation. I had provided the rope and they had eagerly tied the noose. I raised my hand. The security team immediately stepped back, maintaining a tight defensive perimeter, but allowing the room to fall into a heavy, panting silence. Damon stood in the center of the boardroom, his suit rumpled, his face slick with sweat. He looked at me completely broken. He had lost his estate, his marriage, and his freedom. He believed he had reached the absolute bottom of the abyss. He was incorrect. I adjusted my silver tie and leaned forward, resting my forearms on the mahogany table. I addressed Damon and Ebony directly. I told them that the federal indictments for wire fraud and conspiracy would undoubtedly result in severe prison sentences. However, I explained that the criminal charges were merely the opening act of their consequences. I directed their attention back to the massive digital wall screen. I clicked the projector remote one final time. A complex corporate organizational chart illuminated the display. At the very bottom of the chart was the offshore lending entity that had authorized the $2 million bridge loan. The loan Damon had secured using my forged signature, the money they desperately needed to survive. I traced the digital lines upward through a labyrinth of international shell companies, blind trusts, and anonymized holding firms. The corporate structure was a masterpiece of financial obfuscation designed to completely mask the true origin of the capital. I explained to my children that international banks rarely authorized massive bridge loans based solely on a residential quitclaim deed without conducting exhaustive physical audits. They required immense verified collateral. The organizational chart culminated in a single definitive apex at the top of the screen. The ultimate parent company controlling the entire offshore lending syndicate was displayed in bold, undeniable text. It was a private wealth management firm registered exclusively under my name. Damon stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open in silent, paralyzing comprehension. Ebony stopped sobbing, her eyes fixed on the corporate logo. I delivered the final, crushing strike. I informed them that they did not successfully defraud a faceless international banking conglomerate. The shadow corporation that funded their illegal $2 million bridge loan was owned and operated entirely by me. I had personally authorized the transfer of my own capital into their fraudulent account, knowing exactly what they intended to do with it. They did not steal the money from a bank. They stole it directly from their father. I stated the absolute, inescapable reality of their situation. The federal government would seize whatever meager assets they possessed to satisfy the criminal penalties. But the civil liability of the $2 million debt plus exorbitant compounding corporate interest belonged entirely to my private firm. They were not merely bankrupt. They were financially enslaved to me for the rest of their natural lives. Every dollar they earned, every asset they attempted to acquire upon their eventual release from federal prison would be immediately garnished to satisfy the stolen bridge loan. They had attempted to erase me, but I had permanently chained them to my shadow. The profound silence in the executive boardroom was heavy enough to crush a man's spine. Damon stared at the glowing corporate organizational chart. The reality of his absolute financial enslavement short-circuited his brain. The arrogant facade he had worn for the last decade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He realized the vast, inescapable gravity of his situation. He had attempted to outsmart a man who played international corporate chess, while Damon was still struggling with basic checkers. His legs completely lost their structural integrity. Damon dropped to his knees on the plush imported carpet of the boardroom. The dull thud of his kneecaps striking the floor echoed across the vast space. He did not attempt to maintain his dignity. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, closing the short distance to the edge of the polished mahogany table. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and overflowing with tears. He unleashed a pathetic, broken torrent of begging. He clasped his hands together in a gesture of frantic prayer, pleading for mercy. He cried openly, his chest heaving with violent, ragged sobs. He completely abandoned his previous narrative of being a victim of his wife's manipulation. Instead, he attempted to generate sympathy by shifting the blame onto the abstract forces of the corporate world. He wailed that the intense pressure of maintaining his premium lifestyle had fractured his judgment. He blamed a series of catastrophic real estate investments and aggressive market fluctuations for pushing him into an impossible corner. He sobbed that he only forged the quitclaim deed because he was terrified of losing everything and embarrassing the family name. I sat perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair. I looked down at the weeping, trembling man kneeling on the floor. I felt absolutely zero pity. I did not see a desperate son asking for paternal salvation. I saw a parasitic entity who had willingly plotted to drug my coffee, declare me insane, and lock me inside a medical facility to steal my life's work. His tears were not born of genuine remorse. They were the chemical byproduct of getting caught. He was mourning the loss of his stolen millions, not the destruction of his morality. I did not offer him a comforting hand. I did not utter a single word of reassurance. I let his pathetic sobs fill the clinical corporate space, forcing him to stew in the absolute degradation of his own making. Ebony stood near the far wall, her face buried in her trembling hands, vibrating with silent terror. She understood that Damon's begging was completely futile. She had witnessed firsthand the uncompromising ruthlessness I utilized to build my logistics empire from a single delivery truck into a global syndicate. She knew that manufactured tears held absolutely zero currency in this room. I leaned forward, resting my clasped hands on the cool mahogany wood. My voice was a low, glacial rumble that instantly silenced Damon's frantic weeping. I informed him that his excuses were entirely irrelevant and mathematically absurd. I stated that the global economy did not force him to forge a highly secure legal document. Financial pressure did not force him to secure an illegal offshore bridge loan against a property he did not own. The fluctuating real estate market did not force him to mock my grief over Coretta or plan my forced medical confinement. His actions were the direct, undeniable result of pure, unadulterated greed. I told him he had permanently forfeited the right to call himself my heir. He was now strictly my debtor. I outlined the final, non-negotiable terms of their survival. I signaled Aaron. My attorney opened his heavy leather briefcase and extracted a thick stack of newly drafted legal contracts. He slid the documents across the table. They stopped precisely at the edge, looming directly above Damon's kneeling form. I explained the strict mechanics of the blood clause. I demanded absolute, unconditional surrender. Damon and Ebony were required to immediately sign over the titles to every single luxury vehicle they possessed. They were ordered to completely liquidate their personal investment portfolios, empty their private checking accounts, and surrender all high-value physical assets. Every designer watch, every diamond necklace, and every piece of premium real estate they claimed to own would be immediately transferred to my private holding firm to offset the fraudulent debt. I made it unequivocally clear that they would leave this skyscraper with absolutely nothing but the clothes currently resting on their backs. They would be forced to start their lives entirely from scratch, securing entry-level employment to rent basic, unremarkable apartments. They would learn the brutal, unforgiving reality of living paycheck to paycheck exactly as their mother and I had done 40 years ago. In exchange for this total financial annihilation, I offered a single, highly conditional concession. If Damon and Ebony signed the full legally binding confessions detailing their exact roles in the forgery and wire fraud, I would officially instruct the federal investigator to withhold criminal prosecution against my biological children. I would absorb the financial damage within my shadow corporation and grant them total amnesty from federal prison. Damon stared at the harsh black ink of the confession documents. He looked over his shoulder at Ebony. My daughter slowly nodded, her face pale and entirely defeated. They recognized the brutal mercy of the offer. Total poverty was a terrifying prospect, but it was infinitely preferable to spending the next 2 decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary. They were ready to sign away their entire false existence to save their physical freedom. Heather and Brent did not share this sentiment. The White in-laws stood near the rear of the boardroom, their faces twisted with indignant aristocratic fury. Heather completely rejected the reality of her absolute powerlessness. She refused to accept that her master plan had culminated in total defeat. She aggressively stepped away from the glass wall, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She pointed a trembling finger at Aaron and loudly declared that she would never sign a confession or surrender a single diamond. She insisted her offshore accounts were entirely untouchable and that her high-priced legal team would rip my contracts to shreds in open court. Brent immediately backed her up, puffing out his chest and loudly proclaiming that this entire meeting was an illegal, highly actionable hostage situation. Brent sneered at Damon, calling him a pathetic coward for kneeling before a washed-up old man. Heather grabbed her designer handbag. She grabbed Brent's arm. They turned their backs on the mahogany table and marched directly toward the heavy double doors. They arrogantly announced they were leaving the building, taking a private car to the international terminal and boarding their scheduled flight to Paris. They genuinely believed their inherent privilege made them entirely immune to the catastrophic consequences of their actions. They did not make it to the doorway. The federal investigator stood up. His chair screeched violently against the floorboards. He moved with terrifying speed, stepping directly into the path of the fleeing couple. He planted his heavy boots firmly on the carpet, using his broad shoulders to completely block the exit. He did not issue a polite warning. He commanded them to halt immediately, his voice echoing with absolute, uncompromising governmental authority. Heather attempted to shove past him, screaming that he had no jurisdiction to hold her against her will. The investigator did not flinch. He easily deflected her physical assault with a single rigid forearm. I remained seated at the head of the table. I watched the panic finally seize control of Heather's eyes. I spoke in a clear, resonant tone, ensuring every syllable registered in her desperate brain. I informed her that she had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my mercy. I explicitly clarified that the amnesty deal outlined in the legal documents was an exclusive offer. The financial pardon and the protection from federal prosecution were strictly reserved for my direct blood relatives. Damon and Ebony would be spared because they shared my DNA. The White in-laws held absolutely zero value to my legacy. Heather gasped, her arrogant facade crumbling into pure, unadulterated horror. Brent stumbled backward, his face draining of all color as the inescapable trap slammed shut forever. The federal investigator reached to the back of his duty belt. He retrieved 2 pairs of heavy, solid steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic clinking sound filled the silent boardroom. He seized Brent's wrist, twisting his arm behind his back with practiced, overwhelming force. He snapped the cold steel around Brent's wrist, ignoring the man's frantic, pathetic pleas for an attorney. He grabbed Heather's arm, forcing her hands together despite her wild thrashing and hysterical screaming. He locked the cuffs tightly, permanently binding them to the catastrophic consequences of their overwhelming greed. The heavy double doors of the executive boardroom clicked shut, sealing the absolute finality of Heather and Brent's departure. The frantic echoes of my daughter-in-law's hysterical screaming faded into the carpeted hallway, leaving behind a suffocating clinical silence. Damon and Ebony remained completely frozen. They stared at the closed doors, processing the uncompromising reality of the federal justice system. Their spouses had been physically shackled and hauled away to face catastrophic legal ruin. The amnesty deal resting on the mahogany table was no longer a negotiation tactic. It was their singular lifeline. I allowed the terrifying silence to press down on their shoulders, letting the absolute destruction of their meticulously planned lives fully crystallize. Damon was the first to break the static hold. He slowly turned his head and looked at the stack of legal confessions Aaron had prepared. His complexion was the color of wet ash. He swallowed hard, recognizing that he possessed absolutely zero leverage. He had no hidden accounts, no secret allies, and no brilliant counter-strategy. He was a thoroughly defeated man standing in the undeniable shadow of the empire he had foolishly attempted to conquer. He took a hesitant step toward the table. Ebony followed immediately behind him. Her posture shattered her head, bowed in ultimate submission. Aaron unclasped a silver fountain pen and placed it deliberately in the center of the text-heavy documents. He coldly informed my children that the investigator required their full uncoerced signatures on every single page, outlining their explicit involvement in the international wire fraud and the forgery of the quitclaim deed. He stated that any hesitation would immediately void the blood clause, resulting in their instant arrest and transport to the federal holding facility. The federal investigator crossed his arms, staring at Damon with a look of pure intimidation. The absolute weight of the government pressed against my son's chest. Damon reached out and picked up the silver pen. His right hand was shaking so violently he could barely grip the smooth metal barrel. He closed his eyes tightly, a single tear escaping and tracking down his jawline. He was legally admitting to being a criminal, a fraud, and a failure. He pressed the nib to the paper and scratched his signature across the bottom of the first page. The sound of the pen against the heavy document was the only noise in the expansive boardroom. He flipped the page and signed again. He repeated the process 24 times. Ebony stepped forward to take his place. She did not bother to read the dense legal paragraphs detailing her complicity in the psychological manipulation and financial theft. She picked up the discarded pen with trembling, ice-cold fingers. She signed her name with quick, jagged strokes, desperate to secure her physical freedom. She pushed the stack of papers back across the polished wood. The investigator reviewed every signature, verifying the authenticity of their unconditional surrender. He nodded sharply to Aaron, confirming the legal parameters of the amnesty agreement were locked. He secured the documents inside his manila folder and stepped back. I remained perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair. The criminal threat was neutralized, but the civil debt of $2 million remained entirely active. I looked at the two exhausted, broken individuals standing before me. I demanded the surrender of their physical collateral. I instructed them to empty their pockets, remove their premium jewelry, and hand over the keys to any vehicle purchased with stolen funds. They were entirely stripped of the unearned privilege they had wielded like a weapon. Damon closed his eyes, his chest heaving with a fresh wave of profound humiliation. He fumbled with the intricate clasp of his massive platinum Rolex. He had purchased that timepiece utilizing funds secretly siphoned from a subsidiary corporate account. He pulled the heavy, diamond-encrusted watch from his wrist and placed it gently onto the mahogany table. He reached into his tailored trousers and extracted his thick leather wallet. He pulled out the electronic key fob to his imported sports car and dropped it beside the watch. He emptied his pockets of every single premium credit card, tossing them onto the table. Ebony reached up to her earlobes with violently trembling hands. She unfastened the backing of her flawless 2-carat diamond earrings. She had flaunted those stones at countless country club luncheons, wearing them as a glittering badge of her manufactured superiority. She pulled the sharp posts from her ears and dropped the diamonds onto the table. They scattered across the wood, catching the fluorescent light. She opened her designer handbag and produced the keys to her luxury SUV, placing them quietly next to her brother's surrendered wealth. They stood before me, stripped of their armor, entirely exposed, and thoroughly bankrupted. I gestured toward the double doors. I told them they were officially dismissed from the building. Damon and Ebony turned and walked out of the boardroom in absolute silence. They did not look back. I pivoted my leather chair toward the expansive floor-to-ceiling glass wall overlooking the downtown district. I tapped into the building's exterior security cameras using my encrypted laptop. I watched the high-definition feed as my two children exited the heavy glass doors of the lobby and stepped out onto the freezing, rain-slicked pavement. They possessed no car keys. They possessed no digital currency. They had to walk. I watched Damon pull the collar of his ruined expensive suit tight against his neck as the bitter winter wind whipped aggressively down the avenue. Ebony wrapped her arms around her chest, shivering violently in her thin designer blouse. They trudged slowly down the concrete sidewalk, navigating the dirty puddles and the biting sleet. They walked for 4 blocks until they reached a miserable, uncovered public transit stop. They huddled together under the freezing rain, waiting for a municipal bus to carry them back to the shattered remnants of their lives. I sat in the warm, silent isolation. I watched my blood relatives suffer the freezing indignity of absolute poverty. I did not smile at their profound misfortune. I did not feel the intoxicating rush of a victorious conqueror. I felt only the heavy, solemn weight of a seasoned surgeon performing an amputation. I had taken a sharp, unforgiving scalpel to my own family tree. I had systematically hunted down the rotting, necrotic tissue of their greed and severed it completely. It was a brutal, agonizing procedure, but it was absolutely necessary. I had to cut out the infection to save the body. The quiet rustle broke the silence. Aaron was meticulously packing his legal briefcase. He gathered the remaining authenticated financial files, the federal warrants, and the signed transfer deeds. He snapped the brass lock shut with a sharp, definitive click. He looked up, adjusting his glasses. He asked me a highly practical question. He pointed out that the massive, sprawling estate was now completely legally secured and entirely vacant. He asked me what I intended to do with the enormous empty property now that the war was officially won. I remained facing the towering glass window, looking out over the vast, sprawling expanse of the city skyline. I turned away from this towering glass window overlooking the sprawling city skyline. I looked at my attorney, absorbing the practical weight of his question. Aaron wanted to know what my immediate plans were for the massive vacant property. I answered him with absolute, unwavering certainty. I told him I was simply going home. I did not require a corporate security escort or a chauffeured town car. I retrieved the keys to my personal vehicle, a reliable 10-year-old sedan that Damon had frequently mocked as a senile embarrassment. The drive from the downtown financial district to the suburban estate was a journey through shifting atmospheres. The freezing rain had finally subsided, leaving behind a bitter, biting chill that clung to the wet asphalt. I drove in total silence. I did not turn on the radio. My mind was meticulously processing the finality of the afternoon. The surgical extraction was complete. The parasites had been permanently severed from the host. I turned my vehicle onto the long, winding gravel driveway of the estate. The towering oak trees that lined the perimeter cast long, dark shadows across the manicured lawns. I parked near the front steps, stepping out into the biting evening air. The massive, multi-million-dollar house stood before me like a hollow monument. Just hours prior, this property had been the epicenter of a vicious, chaotic war. Now it was cloaked in a profound, heavy silence. I climbed the marble steps and unlocked the heavy mahogany front doors, stepping into the grand foyer. The quiet was absolute. It pressed against my eardrums, magnifying the echo of my leather shoes against the hardwood floor. I walked into the formal living room and stood in the center of the space. The environment was entirely contaminated by Heather's obsessive, sterile aesthetic. During her brief reign as the self-appointed matriarch, she had aggressively modernized the interior. She had transformed a warm, inviting family home into a cold, soulless museum designed strictly for visual intimidation and country club bragging rights. Her influence was a physical violation of the space. Massive, incomprehensible pieces of abstract modern art hung on the walls, replacing the warm landscapes and family portraits Coretta had carefully collected over 4 decades. Heavy metallic silver silk curtains blocked the natural light, draping the windows in a stiff, unwelcoming fabric. The room reeked of manufactured arrogance. I did not call a moving company. I did not wait for the morning. I removed my tailored suit jacket, draping it carefully over the back of a dining chair, and rolled up my sleeves. The physical eradication of their presence began immediately. I walked to the nearest window and grabbed the heavy silver silk curtains with both hands. I pulled downward with a sharp, violent exertion of physical force. The expensive fabric tore free from the mounting hardware with a loud, satisfying rip. The metal curtain rod clattered sharply against the hardwood floor. I moved to the next window and repeated the process, systematically tearing down the sterile barriers. The physical labor was intensely therapeutic. It was a mandatory cleansing ritual. I stripped the walls of the gaudy, meaningless abstract canvases, stacking them haphazardly in the center of the room like debris waiting for the incinerator. I gathered the cold geometric glass sculptures Heather had placed on the mantel and deposited them into heavy black garbage bags. I erased every single trace of their unearned entitlement. I spent 3 hours dismantling their aesthetic occupation. I hauled the heavy bags and the discarded modern art out to the side alley, piling them next to the industrial refuse bins. The house slowly began to breathe again. The suffocating layers of their pretense were stripped away, exposing the foundational bones of the home I had built with my own hands. I stood in the center of the living room, feeling a light sheen of sweat on my forehead. The space was bare, but it was finally clean. The eradication was only the first half of the process. The restoration required a much deeper emotional investment. I walked down the main corridor toward my private study. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and knelt on the Persian rug near the built-in bookshelves. I engaged the hidden latch mechanism concealed beneath the bottom shelf, exposing a small recessed floor safe. I inputted the combination, a sequence of numbers corresponding to the exact date Coretta and I had signed the original mortgage for this property. The heavy steel door swung open. Inside rested a large velvet-lined wooden box. I carefully lifted the container and carried it back to the formal living room. I placed it gently onto the central coffee table and opened the brass latch. The box contained the true heart of the estate. I pulled out the framed photographs Heather had callously ordered, boxed up and thrown into the attic the moment she moved in. I held a silver frame capturing Coretta on our 25th wedding anniversary, her smile radiating a warmth that no amount of offshore money could ever replicate. I retrieved a photograph of us standing on the front porch the day the construction was finalized. I meticulously placed every single frame back into its rightful position on the stone mantel. I restored the ceramic vases Coretta had painted herself. I draped her favorite woven blanket across the back of the reading chair. I spent the remainder of the evening meticulously reconstructing the exact environment she had loved. The sterile museum was gone. The home had returned. I stood back and surveyed the living room. The warm amber light from the table lamps illuminated Coretta's smiling face. The overwhelming grief that had anchored me for months was entirely absent, replaced by a profound, impenetrable peace. The heavy grandfather clock in the foyer struck 9. The winter temperature outside had plummeted well below freezing. I was preparing to turn off the lights when a sound broke the absolute silence of the property. It was not the aggressive, entitled pounding of an heir demanding entry. It was a timid, hesitant knock against the thick wood of the mahogany front doors. It was a sound completely devoid of authority. I walked slowly across the foyer, my footsteps muffled by the restored Persian runner. I reached the entryway and pulled the heavy door open. The frigid night wind instantly swept into the foyer. Standing on the marble porch, illuminated by the harsh yellow glow of the exterior security light, was my daughter. Ebony was entirely unrecognizable. The flawless designer wardrobe and the thousands of dollars in premium diamond jewelry were gone. She was wearing a pair of cheap, oversized gray cotton sweatpants and a thin, worn hooded sweatshirt. She was shivering violently, her shoulders hunched forward to conserve whatever meager body heat she possessed. Her perfectly styled hair was flattened by the damp, freezing sleet. She did not project the fiery, arrogant rage that had defined her existence for the past decade. She kept her eyes glued firmly to the wet marble tiles near her battered sneakers. She could not bring herself to meet my gaze. She wrapped her arms tightly around her torso, her teeth chattering audibly in the quiet night. She spoke in a broken, raspy whisper, a voice entirely stripped of its former venom. She did not demand entry to the master suite. She did not ask for a financial bailout or a warm meal. She kept her head bowed and quietly asked if I would allow her to sleep on the concrete floor of the ruined pool house. I stared down at the woman shivering on the wet marble of the porch. The biting winter wind howled around the thick stone pillars, cutting straight through the thin, cheap fabric of her hooded sweatshirt. This was the same person who had stood in my formal living room just weeks prior, draped in thousands of dollars of imported silk and premium diamonds, mocking my grief and plotting to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. She had viewed my vulnerability as an open invitation to strike. She had eagerly calculated the exact monetary value of my demise alongside a man who viewed her as disposable garbage. Now that toxic manufactured arrogance was entirely eradicated, the federal justice system and the crushing immediate weight of absolute poverty had forcefully excised the entitlement from her soul. I did not see a victim standing before me. I saw a survivor who had finally been violently introduced to the inescapable consequences of her own actions. Her eyes remained fixed on the ground, her shoulders trembling uncontrollably against the frigid air. She did not attempt to cross the threshold. She did not dare place a single muddy sneaker onto the restored Persian rug resting just inside the doorway. She respected the boundary because she finally understood the immense, uncompromising power required to enforce it. The raw humility radiating from her shattered posture was not a theatrical performance designed to manipulate my emotions. It was the primal, desperate instinct of a human being who had hit rock bottom and realized the ground was made of solid, unforgiving concrete. I did not swing the heavy mahogany door wide to welcome her inside. I did not offer her a warm blanket or a comforting paternal embrace. The deep infection of greed had been surgically removed, but the healing process required a sterile, harsh environment. Inviting her back into the luxurious warmth of the main house would immediately invalidate the brutal lesson I had just administered. She needed to earn her sanctuary brick by agonizing brick exactly as her mother and I had done 4 decades ago. I stepped back from the freezing gust of wind and held up a single hand, instructing her to wait in the cold. I turned and walked to the solid oak console table positioned near the grand staircase. I opened the top drawer and retrieved the heavy brass key that unlocked the pool house deadbolt. Beside the keys sat a leather-bound notepad and a silver fountain pen. I picked up the pen and began to write with precise, deliberate strokes. I did not draft a letter of forgiveness or a temporary financial reprieve. I compiled a rigorous, uncompromising schedule of intense manual labor. The path back to human decency required physical exhaustion. I documented the exact physical tasks required to maintain the estate grounds. I listed the mandatory removal of the heavy freezing brush accumulating near the eastern fence line. I detailed the required repair of the wooden pool house door frame that Damon had violently splintered with a steel crowbar just hours prior. I outlined the complete disposal of the shattered modern art canvases and heavy trash bags currently piled in the service alley. I assigned her the grueling, unglamorous work of a groundskeeper. I ripped the heavy sheet of paper from the leather binding and walked back to the open doorway. Ebony had not moved an inch. The sleet was beginning to collect on the shoulders of her sweatshirt, melting into dark freezing patches against the gray fabric. I held out the heavy brass key and the folded list of chores. I informed her that the pool house possessed no central heating and the plumbing was currently disconnected. I stated that she was permitted to occupy the concrete floor provided she completed every single task on the written schedule before the sun reached its apex tomorrow morning. I explicitly warned her that failure to execute the manual labor would result in her immediate and permanent expulsion from the property perimeter. There would be no second chances. Ebony slowly raised her trembling hands. She reached out and took the brass key and the paper from my grasp. Her cold fingers brushed against my palm. She did not complain about the freezing conditions. She did not attempt to negotiate for a canvas cot or a portable space heater. She clutched the items tightly to her chest and looked up at me. Her eyes were red and swollen, but they held a profound, unmistakable gratitude. She softly thanked me for the opportunity to work. She recognized the immense value of the lifeline I had offered. It was not a handout. It was a chance to rebuild her shattered dignity through honest, agonizing exertion. She turned away from the warm glow of the foyer and stepped back into the freezing darkness of the estate grounds. I stood in the doorway and watched her navigate the wet gravel driveway. Her steps were slow and heavy, burdened by the physical exhaustion of her total financial collapse. She wrapped her arms around her chest and lowered her head against the biting wind. I watched her small, shivering silhouette disappear behind the tall, manicured hedges separating the main property from the isolated structure. She was returning to the exact room she had violently decimated mere hours ago, forced to sleep amidst the shattered remnants of her own manufactured panic. I reached out and grasped the heavy brass handle of the mahogany door. I pulled it inward, engaging the thick steel deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. The harsh whistling of the winter storm was instantly severed, replaced by the profound, impenetrable silence of the restored estate. I walked slowly across the foyer, my leather shoes pressing softly into the intricate patterns of the Persian rug. The oppressive, sterile atmosphere Heather had forced upon the home was completely neutralized. The walls breathed freely, unburdened by the gaudy, meaningless, abstract canvases that had previously suffocated the space. The harsh silver curtains were gone, allowing the ambient glow of the municipal streetlights to filter naturally through the tall glass windows. I moved past the formal living room, glancing briefly at the silver-framed photographs resting peacefully on the stone mantel. Coretta's smiling face radiated a quiet, enduring strength that guided my every step. I walked down the central hallway and pushed open the swinging door to the kitchen. The space was immaculate, pristine, and entirely silent. I walked directly to the granite counter and retrieved a clean ceramic mug from the wooden cabinet. I poured a measure of hot black coffee from the insulated thermal carafe. The dark liquid steamed gently in the cool air of the room, carrying the rich, bitter scent of roasted beans. I carried the warm mug to the heavy oak dining table positioned near the bay windows. I sat down in my designated chair at the head of the table. The silence surrounding me was not the heavy, anxious quiet of a man waiting for an attack. It was the serene, unshakable stillness of a fortress that had successfully repelled a massive siege. The steady, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock echoed steadily down the corridor, a mechanical heartbeat confirming the enduring life of the house. The shadows stretched comfortably across the hardwood floors. I looked across the polished wood at the empty chair situated directly opposite my own. It was the exact position Coretta had occupied every morning for 40 years. The crushing, paralyzing grief that had previously anchored me to the floorboards was entirely gone. I did not feel the hollow ache of loss. I felt the profound, overwhelming satisfaction of absolute preservation. I raised the ceramic mug to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter black coffee. The heat bloomed in my chest, a quiet victory lap in the aftermath of a brutal war. I had surgically excised the rot of greed and entitlement from my lineage. I had forced my children to confront the devastating consequences of their own treachery. I had protected the legacy my wife and I had bled to build. The foundation holds. The order is restored. Share your thoughts on Jameson's ultimate test of loyalty in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe for more intense corporate drama.